Detective Grayson Molt pressed one gloved hand over the nurse's mouth inside a locked hospital room, certain no one would hear her final breath. He had planned this for 3 days. The shift change window, the dead security camera in corridor 4, the fire door propped open at the east stairwell. He leaned his full weight against her, watching her eyes go wide, and felt something close to relief. Then the overhead lights exploded on. The door didn't open. It came off the frame. 4 FBI agents moved through the gap in formation, weapons leveled, shouting his name. Behind them stood a woman in a federal jacket and 2 men in military investigator credentials. Molt spun around. The nurse he had been silencing reached up with precise, controlled hands, removed his grip from her jaw like she was unbuckling a seatbelt, and stepped to the side. She was completely calm. Her name was Sera Voss, and she had been waiting for him. If this story already has you gripping your seat, stay with me until the very end. Hit subscribe so you never miss what happens next. Drop a like if Sera's already earned it, and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it started. The shift started at 11, the way all of Sera Voss's shifts started, with cold coffee, a broken elevator, and somebody's chart filed under the wrong patient ID. She pulled on her badge lanyard without looking at it, tucked her stethoscope into her left scrubs pocket, and moved through the double doors of Harlow Veterans Medical Center with the particular walk of someone who had learned not to hurry because hurrying got you noticed. 5 years at this facility had taught her that much. Keep your head down, finish your documentation, don't make enemies, don't make friends, and go home before the day shift administrator started asking questions about overtime. It was a discipline she had borrowed from an older life. Harlow was a federal veterans hospital in Calverton, a mid-sized industrial city in the eastern interior that had once been known for its manufacturing corridor and was now better known for its pension shortfalls and its struggling downtown. The facility served roughly 400 inpatient veterans across 6 wards, and it operated the way most understaffed institutions operated, by asking people to do more than their job description allowed and rewarding them with nothing except the implicit threat of what would happen if they stopped. Sera had seen worse. She had worked in conditions where the ceiling was a tarp and the operating table was a door across 2 sawhorses, where the generator cut out mid-surgery and you finished by flashlight and instinct. 4 years as a Navy Special Operations trauma medic had calibrated her sense of difficult, and Harlow Veterans Medical Center, with its institutional beige and its malfunctioning IV pumps, did not register on that scale. What it did have was a problem she hadn't expected when she took the job. The problem's name was Detective Grayson Molt. She encountered him for the first time 8 months into her tenure at Harlow, when a patient arrived in Ward 3. A 46-year-old veteran named Lewis Garrett, retired Army infantry, admitted for what the intake sheet described as injuries sustained in a residential fall. Sera had taken one look at Garrett's wound pattern and known the intake sheet was wrong. The bruising distribution was inconsistent with a fall. The impact sites on his upper arms and across his rib cage were consistent with restraint, someone holding him while someone else struck him. She had seen that pattern before, in places where people couldn't exactly file a report about it afterward. She flagged it. The resident on call agreed with her read, noted it in the chart, and then erased the note 4 hours later after a uniformed officer from the Calverton Police Department came to the floor and spoke to the charge nurse in the hallway. The next morning, the chart showed a revised assessment. Patient had presented with injuries consistent with a fall down exterior stairs. Witness statements confirmed. Sera had pulled up the original scan herself. She had a photographic memory for imaging, another thing the Navy had cultivated, and she was certain of what she'd seen. She asked the charge nurse about it. The charge nurse told her to leave it alone. She asked the resident. The resident looked at the floor. She didn't leave it alone. She documented what she remembered in her personal notes and filed a quiet internal complaint through the facility's patient advocacy system. 3 weeks later, she received a memo informing her that the complaint had been reviewed and closed, and that she was reminded of the hospital's policy regarding staff interference with active law enforcement investigations. She had not known there was an active law enforcement investigation. She still didn't know what it was investigating, but she knew the name of the detective who had come to the floor and spoken to the charge nurse. It was on the sign-in sheet, which she photographed before the paper copy disappeared. Detective Grayson Molt, Calverton PD. Major Crimes Division. Well, the second time she crossed paths with him was more direct. It was a Tuesday, 6 weeks after the Garrett incident, and Molt arrived on the fourth floor with a uniformed officer beside him and a clipboard under his arm. He was looking for a patient, a veteran named Darnell Pruitt, admitted 2 days earlier with a gunshot wound to the left shoulder. The official police report listed the shooting as a random attempted robbery near the Calverton Transit Hub. Sera had treated Pruitt's wound and noted immediately that the trajectory didn't fit. A robbery shooting from the angles described would have entered differently. The entry wound's position suggested the shot had come from above and behind, which meant either the shooter had been elevated or Pruitt had been moving away. Neither of those scenarios matched a robbery confrontation. She had put it in the nursing notes. Carefully worded, technically precise, the kind of language that meant something to anyone who knew how to read it. Molt came to the floor and asked to see the nursing notes. Sera was the one who handed him the tablet. He read for about 40 seconds, then looked up at her over the screen with the expression of a man who has found a small inconvenience and is deciding whether to step on it or go around it. He had a square jaw and small eyes set too close together, and the way he held himself communicated the absolute, unconsidered certainty of a person who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. "You're the one who wrote this?" "Yes." "This trajectory analysis?" "That's the nursing assessment, yes." He handed the tablet back. "You're a nurse." "I am." "Not a forensic specialist?" "No," she said. "I'm the person who cleaned and treated the wound." Molt looked at the uniformed officer beside him, and something passed between them. Not a glance exactly, more like a shared assumption. Then he looked back at Sera and said, with the patience of someone explaining traffic rules to a child, "The official report has been filed. The wound documentation should reflect the incident as reported. I'd recommend you revise your notes to align with the established record." Sera held his gaze for 2 full seconds. "I document what I observe. That's my professional obligation." "And my professional advice," Molt said, his voice dropping just slightly, "is that you think carefully about the kind of attention you're drawing to yourself." He left without waiting for her to respond. The uniformed officer followed, and the floor went quiet, in that particular way it did when something had happened that everyone pretended not to have witnessed. Sera stood at the nursing station and looked down at the tablet in her hands. She did not revise the notes. The third time was worse. It came in the form of a meeting with Hospital Director Brennan Louth, a carefully groomed administrator who had occupied the director's office for 11 years, and who had the practiced warmth of someone who had once cared about medicine and had since transitioned fully into caring about metrics. Louth called her in on a Thursday afternoon and told her, with his hands folded on the desk, that there had been concerns raised about her conduct. "What concerns?" she asked. "Pattern of documentation that conflicts with official external reports, friction with law enforcement personnel conducting legitimate investigations, a general—" He paused. "Pattern of overreach. I document clinical observations accurately. The concern," Louth said carefully, "is that your documentation appears to be shaped by a personal interpretation of events rather than standard clinical assessment." Sera felt the specific cold that came with understanding exactly what was happening. "Someone told you to say this to me." Louth's expression didn't change. "This is a facility review, Ms. Voss. Standard procedure when concerns are— Detective Molt came to you." A pause that lasted just long enough to confirm it. "We received input from the Calverton PD's liaison office. Yes, as a matter of interdepartmental coordination." She left the meeting with her badge still clipped to her lanyard and her job technically intact, but the threat had been delivered in a language she understood completely. Stop noticing things. Stop writing them down. Stop being someone who can't be managed. The problem was that she had been exactly that kind of person for 4 years in the Navy, and she wasn't sure she knew how to be anything else. She started keeping records off-system. Not because she'd planned to. It was instinct. The same instinct that had made her photograph the sign-in sheet 8 months earlier. She used a personal notebook she kept in her locker, encrypted photographs stored on a phone that had never touched the hospital Wi-Fi, and timestamps cross-referenced with her own shift schedule. It wasn't a plan. It was the documentation habit of someone who had learned that the official record was not always the accurate one. 3 weeks after the meeting with Louth, Lewis Garrett was quietly discharged. Darnell Pruitt was transferred to a different facility. Both of their charts were updated. She could see the revision timestamps in the system, even if the content of the revisions was above her access level. She noted the dates. She photographed the timestamps on her personal phone. She wasn't sure what she was building. She only knew that the shape of it felt significant. Two veterans with inconsistent injury presentations. A detective who responded to nursing notes the way most people responded to personal threats. An administrator who had folded immediately when that detective applied pressure. It was a pattern. She didn't know yet what the pattern meant. Then, on a cold Wednesday night in late November, the pattern acquired a center of gravity. His name was Marcus Teal. He was 38, a former Marine Corps logistics officer, and he arrived in the Harlow Emergency Bay at 11:43 p.m. with 2 gunshot wounds, one through the left thigh, one grazing his right forearm, and a blood pressure reading that told Sera he had been bleeding for longer than the arrival story accounted for. The official account, relayed by the 2 Calverton PD officers who brought him in, was that Teal had been caught in the crossfire of a highway altercation near the junction of Route 9 and Calverton Industrial Parkway. Wrong place, wrong time. Civilian incident. The officers had found him on the roadside and transported him directly. Sera took one look at the wound on his thigh and felt something settle into focus. The exit wound was not where it should have been for a lateral crossfire strike. The angle of penetration was wrong for a civilian altercation at road level. She had seen this wound type before, not in a hospital, but on a tarmac in the dark, with rotors overhead and someone shouting coordinates into her ear. This was a precision shot. It had been placed with deliberate intent. She worked on him for 40 minutes. His blood pressure stabilized. He drifted in and out of consciousness, and once, when she was repositioning his arm to check the forearm wound, he grabbed her wrist with surprising force and said, very clearly, "Don't let them move the file." She kept her voice even. "What file?" But he was already under again. She documented the wounds with her standard clinical precision. She noted the trajectory inconsistencies in exactly the careful, technically hedged language she had learned to use. And she photographed the entry and exit sites with the clinical camera from the nursing station, which was standard protocol for gunshot wound admissions. Then she went back to the nurses' station and pulled up everything the hospital system had on Marcus Teal. His intake form listed him as unemployed, residence unknown. But his military service record, which veterans' facilities had access to for benefits verification, showed something different. Teal had served in logistics, that much was accurate. But he had been attached to a unit that contracted through a private defense firm called Aldrin Supply Group, and he had received a general discharge under circumstances that the file described only as administrative, with a secondary notation she had to look at twice. The notation read, "Pending external review, case flagged, Calverton." Calverton. She sat very still for a moment. Then she heard shoes on the floor behind her and turned to find Detective Grayson Molt walking down the hallway toward her with his badge clipped to his belt and the expression of a man who considered his arrival to be, in itself, a form of authority. "I hear you admitted a shooting victim tonight," Molt said, stopping at the nurse's station without announcing himself. "We admit a lot of patients," Sera said. "Marcus Teal." He set his hands flat on the counter. "Highway shooting. I need to look at his intake file and nursing assessment. Patient records require an authorized request form for law enforcement access." Molt's jaw moved slightly. "I'm the investigating officer." "Then you'll have the authorized form." Something shifted in his face, a pressure behind the eyes that she had learned to read as the point where dismissal began to convert into something more dangerous. He said, "Ms. Voss, I have been patient with you. I want you to understand that patience has a limit." "I understand policies have limits," she said. "Patient privacy doesn't, without proper authorization." He leaned forward slightly. "You want to keep this job?" "I want to do this job correctly," she said. "If you have the authorized request form, I'll pull the record immediately." He stared at her for 4 seconds. Then he straightened, turned, and walked back down the hallway without the form and without the record. Sera watched him go. She pulled up Teal's file again, connected her personal phone to the camera with a cable that wasn't hospital-issued, and photographed every page. She wasn't sure yet what Molt was protecting, but she was now certain that Marcus Teal, the Marine with the precision gunshot wounds and the flagged military file, was at the center of it. And she was certain that whatever it was Molt did not want her near it, which meant she was going to stay as close as she possibly could. She found the first solid thread 3 nights later. She had been doing what she always did on quiet nights, reviewing charts, checking documentation, looking for the small inconsistencies that most people filtered out as noise. Teal was still in the recovery ward. His condition had stabilized, but he was not improving as quickly as the physical wounds would have suggested, and she had a theory about why. He wasn't sleeping. He was watching the door. She came to check his vitals at 2 a.m. and found him awake, which she had expected, and sitting up in bed staring at the wall, which she had not. She did her checks in silence for a moment. Then she said quietly, "The file you mentioned, when you came in." He turned his head slowly. His eyes were the flat, cautious eyes of someone who had learned to survive by disclosing nothing. "Don't remember saying that. You were semi-conscious. People say things." A long pause. "What are you after?" "I noticed the trajectory inconsistency on your wounds," she said. "I documented it. That's my job." And Molt came by. The next morning, Teal made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "He always does." He looked at her. "You know what you're holding on to with that documentation? I know it doesn't match the official report. That's the beginning of it." He shifted slightly, grimaced. "Aldrin Supply Group. Look up their DoD contracts from the last 4 years. Then look up the inventory discrepancy reports that got filed and then unfiled." He stopped. "That's all I'm going to say." "That's enough," she said. She finished his vitals check and left the room. She did not go straight to a computer. She went to the break room, sat down with a cup of cold coffee, and thought about what she was doing. She was a nurse in a veterans hospital in a mid-sized city. She had a personal notebook in her locker and encrypted photos on a personal phone. She had a recovering patient with military logistics connections to a defense contractor, and she had a detective who had twice threatened her career and once, if she was reading his manner accurately, suggested something beyond her career. She was not a federal agent. She was not a military investigator. She was a night shift nurse with a background that nobody in this building knew about. But that background included 4 years of working in environments where the wrong information in the wrong hands was the exact mechanism by which people died. She knew how evidence chains worked. She knew how to preserve documentation under pressure. And she knew, with the particular certainty of someone who had learned it in the field, not from a manual, that the moment she stopped gathering information was the moment she became easier to disappear. She pulled out her phone and began composing a carefully worded email to an address she hadn't used in 2 years. The response came by the following afternoon. She read it in her car in the hospital parking structure, with the engine off and the doors locked. "We're aware of Aldrin. We've been building the Calverton connection for 7 months. Stay in place. Document everything. Do not confront directly. We'll be in touch." It was signed with a case number she recognized as FBI field notation format. Sera sat in the dark of the parking structure for a long time. Then she went back inside and started her shift. The suspension came on a Monday. Director Louth delivered it personally, which she hadn't expected. She had expected a memo, maybe an HR representative. Instead, Louth came to the nurse's station at 3 in the afternoon with a printed letter in a sealed envelope and the expression of a man who was doing something he found distasteful but had decided was necessary. "Effective immediately," he said. "Administrative suspension pending review of your documentation practices and a formal complaint filed by the Calverton PD Liaison Office." She took the envelope. "On what grounds, specifically?" "Interference with an active law enforcement investigation. Unauthorized patient record access. A pattern of—" He looked at the letter rather than at her. "Disruptive conduct toward authorized external personnel. I accessed patient records within my authorized scope and in accordance with my clinical responsibilities. The review will determine that." He still wasn't meeting her eyes. "You're asked to surrender your badge to security and leave the premises. You'll be contacted regarding the timeline." She removed her badge from the lanyard. She set it on the counter. She took her stethoscope from her pocket and set that down too. Then she picked up her bag from under the nursing station and walked toward the exit. She did not look at Molt, who was standing at the end of the corridor near the fire door with his arms crossed, watching her go. She didn't need to look. She could feel him. In the parking lot, she sat in her car and checked her phone. There was a message, not from the FBI contact, but from a number she'd been given 3 weeks ago and told to watch for. Phase 2 begins tonight. You're not suspended. You're deployed. Report to the room on your confirmation sheet by 2200. Bring nothing from the hospital. Say nothing to anyone. She read it twice. Then she drove home, changed her clothes, and at 2100 hours drove to a parking garage 2 miles from Harlow Veterans Medical Center, where a woman in a federal jacket was waiting beside a gray sedan. The woman handed her a badge. It was not a nursing badge. "You're going back in tonight," the woman said. "Same room, same floor, but this time we control the camera feed, and he's going to come to you." Sera turned the badge over in her hands. "How confident are you that he'll move tonight?" "He's been watching you for 3 weeks. Now you're suspended, which means you're loose. He's not going to wait." "And if he doesn't confess?" "He will." The woman opened the sedan's back door and pulled out a vest. "He's not careful. He's just never been challenged." Sera took the vest and started putting it on. Her hands were steady. She had spent 4 years doing this. Not this specifically, but work that required you to enter a dangerous space and stay calm inside it long enough for the outcome to shift. She knew what the adrenaline felt like, and she knew how to work through it rather than against it. She had been called many things in her career: disposable, overreaching, unstable, just a nurse. She finished fastening the vest and looked at the federal agent across the roof of the car. "Tell me the room number," she said. She walked back into Harlow Veterans Medical Center at 2215 through a side entrance that the FBI team had unlocked with an administrative override and settled into room 412, a private room on the 4th floor that had been emptied that afternoon under the pretext of a maintenance issue. The lights were off. The room was quiet. The surveillance feed had been rerouted to a federal monitoring station 4 blocks away. She sat on the edge of the bed and waited. She didn't think about what was coming. She thought about Lewis Garrett, whose chart had been altered while he was still in the building. She thought about Darnell Pruitt, transferred before anyone could ask him the right questions. She thought about Marcus Teal, awake at 2 in the morning, watching the door because he knew what it meant when the wrong people decided you'd said too much. She thought about the sign-in sheet she had photographed 8 months ago, the trajectory notes she had refused to revise, the email she had sent from her car in the parking structure. She thought about every moment she had stayed in place when leaving would have been easier. The door handle turned at 2251. Grayson Molt came into the room alone. She heard him before she saw him. The particular careful step of someone who believed he was invisible, who had never had to consider the possibility that the space he was moving through was not actually his to control. He crossed to her side of the bed in the dark. He reached down and placed one gloved hand over her mouth. She felt the leather against her face and felt, alongside it, the absolute stillness of someone who has been exactly here before. Not in a hospital room, but in the kind of dark where everything depends on not moving until the right second. She waited. Molt leaned close and said very quietly, "You had so many chances." He thought she was afraid. He thought she was silent because she had no options. He was wrong on both counts. She reached up with her left hand, found his wrist with the precision of someone who had practiced this movement in conditions far worse than darkness, and held it there, not fighting him, just holding, and said equally quietly, "You're already on record." The overhead light came on like a detonation. The door separated from its frame, and the room that Grayson Molt had entered to commit a quiet, efficient crime became the last place he was ever going to feel certain of anything. The agents moved through the doorway in a tight stack, and the first thing Molt did was what guilty men always do. He looked for the exit. There wasn't one. The 2 agents on his left had the door. The one on his right had the window angle covered without being near it, which told Sera they'd run this room before she ever stepped foot in it. Behind them came a woman in a dark federal jacket with a case number on the back. Special Agent Diane Caro, whose name Sera knew from the email chain, but whose face she was seeing for the first time. Caro moved like someone who had done this so many times, it no longer registered as significant, which Sera found more reassuring than any amount of visible urgency would have been. The 4th person through the door was a man in a military investigator's uniform. Not Army, not Navy, but the specific cross-branch designation that meant someone had handed this case up to a level that outranked Calverton PD by several institutional layers. He was carrying a hard-sided briefcase and wearing the expression of a man who had traveled a long way for this and intended to make it count. Molt stood in the center of the room with his gloved hand now hanging at his side, and he looked at all of them, and then he looked at Sera, and something in his face completed a calculation it had apparently been running for some time. "You recorded me," he said. "The room's been wired since 6 this evening," Caro said, moving past him toward the window. "Everything from the moment you came through the door, everything you said before that." "Before—" He stopped, his jaw tightened. "I want a lawyer." "You'll have one." Caro turned around. "That's not actually the conversation we're having right now." Molt looked at Sera again. The look had changed. Whatever had been there before, the certainty, the quiet assumption of control, was gone, and what replaced it was something rawer and less managed. Not fear exactly. More like the realization that the ground under him was not the ground he'd thought he was standing on. Sera stepped back and let Caro take the center of the room. She had done her part. She knew that, and she was disciplined enough not to need to stay in the frame for it. She moved to the wall near the door and watched. Caro said, "We have your voice on record saying, and I'm quoting directly, you had so many chances. We have you entering this room at 22:51 through a door that was not authorized for your access. We have you making physical contact with a federal operative." She paused. "We also have the 43 seconds before the lights came on, which is already more than we need for the assault charge." Molt said nothing. "What we don't have yet," Caro continued, "is your account of who told you to be here tonight, who gave you this specific room number, because you didn't get that from watching the parking lot." Another silence. Molt was calculating something. Sera could see it in the way his eyes moved. Not darting, but deliberate, the way a man sorts through options when he knows most of them are bad. "I'm not saying anything without counsel," he said finally. "That's your right," Caro said pleasantly. "Agent Reyes, please read Detective Molt his rights and get him processed. We'll continue this conversation with his attorney present." One of the agents stepped forward. Molt let himself be turned and cuffed without physical resistance, but at the last moment, before Reyes moved him toward the door, he looked back at Sera one more time. "You have no idea what you just started," he said. Sera held his gaze. "I think I do," she said. They took him out. The room went quiet in the specific way rooms do after something large has passed through them. Caro waited until the sound of footsteps in the corridor had faded, then turned to Sera. "You all right?" "Yes." "That was not a formality. I'm asking." Sera considered it honestly for a moment. Her pulse was elevated. Her hands were steady. She was tired in the deep, specific way she got tired after sustained focus. Not depleted, just finished with a particular kind of expenditure. "I'm fine," she said. "What happens now?" Caro moved to the briefcase the military investigator had set on the bedside table and opened it. "Now, it gets complicated." The complication announced itself at 6 the following morning in the form of a press conference. Sera watched it from a hotel room 2 blocks from Harlow, where Caro's team had put her for the night. Not for her protection exactly, but because returning to her apartment before the arrest was formally processed created variables that nobody wanted to manage. She had slept 4 hours, which was more than she'd expected, and she was sitting on the bed with her second cup of coffee when the local news cut to the Calverton Police Department's public affairs officer reading from a prepared statement. The statement described Detective Grayson Molt's arrest as a federal matter stemming from an ongoing investigation. It used the words alleged misconduct twice and active cooperation once. It said absolutely nothing about Aldrin Supply Group, military contracting, or the veterans whose records had been altered. It also, notably, said nothing about Police Commander Victor. But the name that came up on screen when the camera panned to the side of the podium was not Victor. It was Deputy Commander Garrett Solon, who was handling media relations in the absence of Police Commander Warren Stahl, who had reportedly been unreachable since the previous evening. Unreachable. Sera put the coffee down and called Caro. "Stahl," she said when Caro picked up. "He's already gone dark." "We know." Caro's voice was flat and fast, the sound of someone managing 3 things at once. "He hasn't crossed state lines. His phone is off, which means he either destroyed it or someone told him to. We have people at his residence and his secondary property in Dunmore County." "Did Molt give him up?" "Molt hasn't said a word since the arrest. His attorney arrived at 4:30 this morning, and they've been in private consultation ever since." A pause. "But we don't need Molt to give us Stahl. We have the recordings." What did the recordings get you? Enough. Another pause, and in it, Sera heard something careful being withheld. There's something else. It came in about an hour ago. I was going to call you this morning, but since you're already on, tell me. Marcus Teal, he was moved last night. Sera went still. Moved where? Off the ward. Someone entered the hospital on a forged administrator credential around midnight and had him transferred to a different floor under a privacy flag. When our people went to check on him at 5 this morning, he was gone. The coffee cup was still on the nightstand. Sera looked at it. Gone as in transferred, or gone as in, we don't know yet. The transfer paperwork lists a facility in the Western District, but that facility has no record of receiving him. Caro's voice dropped a register. We have people looking, but Sera, whoever did this moved fast and they knew the hospital layout. This wasn't improvised. Sera stood up. Someone was watching the operation last night. That's what we think. Which means Molt wasn't the top of it. Molt was never the top of it, Caro said. He was always middle management. Stahl is higher, but even Stahl... She stopped. We're pulling threads. Some of them go further than we initially mapped. Sera crossed to the window and looked out at the Calverton skyline. Industrial cranes, a water tower with the city seal, the edge of Harlow's roofline visible over a parking structure 2 blocks east. I need to go back in, she said. Not yet. Teal told me something in the ward. He said don't let them move the file. I thought it was the confusion of blood loss, but there's a file? I don't know what form it's in, but whatever Teal was protecting, whatever Aldrin doesn't want surfaced, it might still be at Harlow. If they move Teal to stop him from talking, they might not know about the file yet. A longer pause this time. Sera could hear Caro thinking. Give me 40 minutes, Caro said. Don't go in alone. The 40 minutes became 2 hours, which Sera spent going through everything she'd photographed on her personal phone over the past several months. She had been systematic about it in the way that people with military documentation training were systematic. Dates, timestamps, cross-references. She had Garrett's original scan description, Pruitt's wound assessment, Teal's intake notes, the revision timestamps on all 3 charts, and the sign-in sheets from 3 separate dates when Molt had accessed the floor. What she hadn't done, until now, was look at them as a sequence rather than as separate incidents. She spread the photographs across the bed in order and sat on the floor to look at them from a distance. Her old team leader in the Navy had taught her this. When you're too close to the detail, step back until the shape becomes visible. Don't try to read it. Let it reveal itself. It took about 6 minutes. The shape was this. All 3 veterans, Garrett, Pruitt, and Teal, had been admitted through the emergency bay. All 3 had wound presentations that were inconsistent with their official incident reports. All 3 had been accessed by Molt within 48 hours of admission. All 3 had their records revised. But there was something else, something she'd photographed without fully registering at the time. On each admission, there was a secondary intake notation, a line in the intake form that dealt with the patient's current employment or contractor affiliation, included for benefits verification purposes. Garrett's listed him as retired, unaffiliated. Pruitt's listed the same. Teal's listed Aldrin Supply Group. But below each of those lines, in the field for referring agency, was a notation she had assumed was routine, KAL7 referral. She had seen it on all 3 forms and had assumed it was an internal hospital code. It wasn't in the standard notation guide, but Harlow had enough legacy administrative systems that unexplained codes were not unusual. Now she pulled up the photographs of all 3 forms side by side and looked at the notation again. KAL7, not a hospital code. She was certain now, looking at it in sequence. Hospital internal codes at Harlow were alphanumeric starting with HVF. This was something else, an external designation, which meant it had been added by whoever referred the patient before admission, not by the admitting intake staff. She needed to know what KAL7 was. She typed it into her phone's browser and got nothing useful. She tried it alongside Calverton, alongside DoD, alongside Aldrin. Then she tried it alongside contracting and got a single result, a cached page from a DoD procurement database that had since been taken offline, showing a line item for a contract vehicle designated Calverton District 7 Supply Logistics, abbreviated CAL7, administered through Aldrin Supply Group. She sat very still for a moment. Then she photographed the screen. KAL7 was not a hospital code. It was a contract vehicle designation, which meant that someone had flagged all three veterans as being connected to the same military contract before they ever arrived at Harlow, which meant the admissions hadn't been coincidental. Someone had been routing specific veterans, ones with knowledge of or connection to the Cal 7 contract, to this specific facility, where Molt was waiting. She called Caro back immediately. Caro picked up on the first ring. KAL 7, Sera said. It's a DoD contract vehicle administered by Aldrin. All three veterans, Garrett, Pruitt, Teal, were flagged with it on their intake forms. They weren't random admissions. Someone was routing them here. A silence that was different from the earlier ones, sharper, more concentrated. Say that again, Caro said. Sera said it again, more slowly, and read the intake field verbatim from each photograph. By the time she finished, she could hear the change in the background noise on Caro's end. More voices, the sound of chairs moving, the particular controlled urgency of a room shifting from one gear to another. This is significant, Caro said. It means this wasn't just witness intimidation, Sera said. It was a pipeline. They were identifying people with KL7 exposure and funneling them to a hospital where the records could be controlled. And Molt was the control mechanism. Yes. Which means Stahl wasn't just running cover for bad arrests. Caro's voice had gone somewhere harder. He was running an intake operation. I need to know what TL7 was actually delivering, Sera said, what the contract was for, because Teal was in logistics. If he was tracking shipments, then he may have seen what was actually moving through the supply chain, Caro finished, and it may not have been what the contract said it was. The line went quiet for 3 seconds. Sera, the file Teal mentioned, do you have any idea what format it would be in? Physical? Digital? I don't know, but he said don't let them move the file. Not destroy, move, which suggests it's something that could be accessed remotely, a digital file in a system somewhere. Maybe the hospital system, maybe an external server. If it's in the hospital system, I still have my login credentials, Sera said. They suspended my badge, not my system access. Nobody thought to lock the account, because nobody thought I was anything other than a nurse who'd been sent home. Another pause. Then Caro said, I need you to hold on that. Don't access anything remotely. They may be monitoring the system since the arrest. We need to go in physically. Then take me in. 2 hours, Caro said. We're pulling something together. Stay at the hotel. The 2 hours passed. Then a third. Sera sat on the floor of the hotel room with her photographs spread around her and worked through every detail she could access from memory, from her notes, from the images on her phone. She was not patient by nature. Patience was a skill she had developed, not a temperament she had been born with. And the effort of staying in the room while Teal was missing and Stahl was dark, and the hospital sat 2 blocks away doing whatever it was doing without her, was the hardest thing she had done in 3 days. At the start of the 4th hour, she got up, put on her jacket, and stood at the window. She was thinking about Teal, not as a case element, as a person, 38 years old, Marine logistics officer, a man who had served correctly and gotten out, and then apparently stumbled into the middle of something that had been running long enough to have its own infrastructure, its own intake system, its own designated enforcer. He had grabbed her wrist in the dark and said, "Don't let them move the file," with the urgency of someone who had been carrying that sentence for a long time and needed to hand it to someone before it was too late. She hadn't asked him which file. She hadn't had time, and he'd gone under again, but now she thought about it differently. He hadn't said there is a file. He'd said, "Don't let them move it." Present tense, specific location implied, as if it was somewhere she could reach. She pulled up the hospital system login on her personal phone, not through the VPN, not through any channel Caro had told her to avoid, and navigated to the patient records section. She didn't access anything, she just looked at the structure. The directory tree, the file organization system. Standard records were organized by patient ID and admission date. But there was a secondary archive system. A legacy system from before Harlow had migrated to its current software platform 5 years ago, that still held records from the transition period. It wasn't actively maintained. Most staff didn't know it existed. Sera knew about it because she'd once had to retrieve a record from 2019 for a long-term patient whose original intake had been processed on the old system. She navigated to the legacy archive. She didn't search by name. She searched by contract code. CAL 7. One result. It was not a medical record. It was a document file, uploaded in the old system's format, under a patient ID that didn't correspond to any current admission. The upload date was 7 months ago. The file size was significant, hundreds of pages, not a simple intake form. She didn't open it. She took a screenshot of the directory entry, including the file ID, and called Caro. "I found it," she said. "I didn't open it, but it's in the legacy archive system at Harlow, under the KL7 tag, in a file that someone uploaded 7 months ago and buried under a ghost patient ID." The line was silent long enough that she checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "Caro." "I'm here." Caro's voice had gone quiet in a particular way. "Sera, I need you to listen to me very carefully." Something in the tone made the back of Sera's neck tighten. "What is it?" "We found Teal." "Where?" "He's alive." A beat. "He's at a private clinic in the Western District. We found the transfer record buried under a different patient name. He's in stable condition, but he's been sedated. Someone wanted him under." Sera exhaled slowly. "Alive. Sedated, but alive." "And whoever sedated him, we think it was authorized at the hospital level," Caro said. "Not by someone external, by someone with administrative credentials inside Harlow." Sera stared at the phone screen. "Louth. We don't know yet. Brennan Louth has the administrative credentials to authorize a transfer under a privacy flag and change the record afterward. He's the one who suspended me. He's the one who told me Molt had been in contact with the liaison office." "We're looking at him." "Look faster," Sera said, "because if Louth knows that file exists, and if Teal told someone where it was—" "I know." Caro's voice sharpened. "We're moving on the hospital in 40 minutes. I need you staged at the east entrance. Bring your credentials and stay off the hospital network until we're physically inside." Sera was already picking up her jacket. "I'll be there in 15. "Sera." A pause. "There's one more thing." She stopped. "The military investigator who was in the room last night, Major Dench. He ran the CAL-7 contract number through the DoD database this morning." Another pause, and in it Sera felt the particular weight of information that changes the shape of everything around it. Aldrin Supply Group has been filing falsified inventory reports with the DoD for at least 3 years. But that's not the worst part. "Tell me." "The discrepancy isn't materials or equipment, it's weapons." Caro's voice was steady and deliberate. "Military-grade weapons systems designated for decommission were being logged as destroyed. But the destruction records are fabricated. The weapons were rerouted." Sera stood in the center of the hotel room with her jacket half on and felt the full architecture of it settle into place. The veterans with inconvenient knowledge, the hospital pipeline, the corrupted records, the enforcer with a badge who made sure anyone who got too close ended up either silenced or discredited. "That's what's in the file," she said. "We think so." "That's what Teal was protecting." "Yes." She finished putting on her jacket. She checked that her phone was fully charged. She checked the backup drive she'd been carrying for 6 weeks. The one with every photograph, every timestamp, every documented inconsistency she'd collected since the first night she looked at Lewis Garrett's chart and understood that the official record was a lie. 40 minutes, east entrance. She had been underestimated by this building since the night she walked into it. She had been called unstable, overreaching, just a nurse. She had been suspended, threatened, and maneuvered out of the building she'd spent 5 years learning down to its last stairwell. Now she was going back in with federal credentials and a file number, and somewhere in Harlow's legacy archive system was the document that would determine whether the people who had built this pipeline faced consequences or walked away from them. She locked the hotel room behind her and took the stairs. In the parking garage at the east side of the building, a gray sedan was already waiting, engine running. Caro stood beside it with 2 agents and Major Dench, who had the briefcase and the expression of someone prepared for this to get significantly harder before it got simpler. Sera crossed the garage and stopped in front of them. "There's something you need to know before we go in," Dench said, without preamble. He opened the briefcase and turned a document toward her. "We ran the financial trace on the weapons diversion. The money moved through 4 shell accounts before it landed anywhere traceable." He pointed to a line near the bottom of the document. "The final destination account is registered to a holding company. The holding company has one named officer." Sera looked at the name. It was not Warren Stahl. It was not Grayson Molt. It was not Brennan Louth. The name on the document was someone she had seen once. Not inside Harlow, not inside the Calverton PD, but in a photograph on the wall of Director Louth's office, standing beside him at what looked like a federal funding ceremony, smiling with the particular comfort of someone who understood that the camera was the least dangerous thing in the room. She recognized the face. She had not known the name until now. "Who is this?" she asked, though part of her had already started to understand. Dench said the name. And Sera looked up from the document and understood that everything she had gathered, every photograph, every timestamp, every carefully worded nursing note, was only the outer edge of something that went much deeper than a corrupt detective and a compromised hospital director. The real center of it had never been in Harlow at all. The name on the document was Aldrin Ferris, not Warren Stahl, not Brennan Louth, not anyone whose name had appeared in a police report or a hospital memo or a federal warrant. Aldrin Ferris was the kind of name that existed in the spaces between official documents, a man whose presence in public record was almost entirely ceremonial. A photograph on a wall, a signature on a funding agreement, a face at the right events, standing close enough to power to benefit from it without being close enough to be held responsible for what it did. Sera had seen that photograph in Louth's office 8 months ago and registered it the way you register background detail. Not as information, just as texture. A hospital director and a man in a good suit at a federal funding ceremony. She had not thought about it again. She looked at it now with the specific attention of someone reconstructing a landscape from pieces they had collected without knowing they were collecting. "Ferris," she said. "What's his position?" "Officially, he's a private infrastructure consultant," Dench said. "He advises regional government offices on facilities contracts and federal funding allocation. He has no formal role with the DoD, no formal role with Calverton PD, no formal role with Aldrin Supply Group, which, incidentally, is named after him, though his name doesn't appear on any of the corporate filings. It's named after him. The company was incorporated by a former business partner 11 years ago. Ferris provided the seed capital under a loan structure that was never repaid and never called in. Technically, he's a creditor. Practically, Dench closed the briefcase. He owns it. And the weapons diversion revenue has been flowing into his holding company for at least 3 years. Caro had been listening without interrupting. Now she said, Ferris also sits on the board of the Calverton Regional Hospital Authority, the oversight body that controls Harlow's administrative appointments, including the director position. Sera looked at her. He put Louth there. We think Louth was recruited, yes, not coerced, recruited. The distinction matters legally. Sera thought about Louth's office. The careful grooming, the practiced warmth, the way he had delivered her suspension with his hands folded on the desk, not meeting her eyes. He had not looked like a man doing something he was comfortable with. He had looked like a man who had calculated some time ago that the discomfort was worth it and was now too far in to recalculate. What does Ferris know about last night? She asked. We don't know, Caro said. Molt's attorney has been in contact with 3 different phone numbers since 4 this morning. 2 of them are law firms. One of them we're still tracing. If that trace leads to Ferris, then he knows the arrest happened and he's already managing the exposure. Sera looked at the east entrance of Harlow, 40 meters across the parking garage. Then we need that file before he finds a way to reach it. Caro nodded once. Stay behind Reyes. Don't access anything until we have eyes on the server room. They went in. What? The east entrance brought them into the administrative corridor, which at this hour was quieter than the clinical floors but not empty. A facilities worker with a cart of cleaning supplies, 2 administrators moving in the opposite direction with coffee cups, and the distracted energy of people who had heard something had happened and were trying to assess how much it affected them. Caro's team moved without urgency, which Sera had learned was the correct approach. Urgency drew attention. Purposeful movement at a measured pace was nearly invisible. The server room was on the basement level, past the medical records department, and behind a door that required both a key card and a PIN. Sera had the key card. Hers had been deactivated, but the IT department kept a master access card in a lockbox above the server room door, and she knew the lockbox combination because she'd had to retrieve it twice for legitimate reasons, and no one had thought to change it after her suspension. Reyes got the door open in under 40 seconds. Inside, the room was cold and loud with the hum of server racks, and the overhead fluorescents flickered twice before stabilizing. The legacy archive system ran on a separate physical server, older hardware, beige casing. the kind of machine that looked out of place among the newer racks. Sera had worked with the hospital's IT team enough to know which terminal accessed it. She sat down at the terminal, and for a moment her fingers were on the keyboard, and she was looking at a login screen, and she felt the specific weight of what she was about to do. Not fear. Something more structural than fear. The understanding that once she opened this file, whatever it contained became the central fact of the situation, and everything that had happened until now would be reordered around it. She logged in. The directory loaded. She navigated to the legacy archive. She found the KL7 entry with the ghost patient ID. "I'm going to open it," she said. "Open it," Caro said from behind her. The file was large. It took 11 seconds to load. When it did, the first thing visible was a cover page. Not a medical cover page, but a document header from what appeared to be an internal inventory system. The letterhead read, Aldrin Supply Group, Logistics Division, Restricted Distribution. Below the header, CAL7 Reconciliation Report, prepared by M. Teal. Date, 18 months ago. Sera started reading. Teal had been thorough. Whatever his position in the logistics chain had been, he had access to enough of the system to document discrepancies that someone with less visibility would have missed entirely. The report ran across hundreds of pages and covered 3 years of Aldrin's DoD contract deliverables under the KL7 vehicle. On paper, the contract was for supply logistics, consumables, maintenance equipment, vehicle components, standard military support contracting. What Teal had documented was the gap between what the contract said was being delivered and what the physical inventory confirmed was present. The gap was not small. Over 3 years, the reconciliation showed a shortfall of military-grade weapons systems, mostly small arms and portable munitions, whose paper trail ended at a decommissioned facility in eastern Calverton and whose physical trail ended nowhere. They were not at the decommissioned facility. They were not at any other logged location. They had simply, in the language of the inventory system, ceased to exist. Except Teal had found the secondary ledger. It was embedded in the report as an attachment, a spreadsheet that cross-referenced the missing inventory against a series of transaction codes that didn't correspond to any official DoD accounting category. Teal had apparently spent several months mapping those codes against known routing identifiers and had concluded, in a section of the report he had labeled preliminary findings, not for distribution, that the missing weapons systems had been moved through a civilian logistics network and sold. The buyers were identified by transaction code, not by name. But Teal had decoded enough of the transaction codes to show that the money had gone somewhere, and one of the destination markers in the transaction data matched a code that Sera, looking at it, recognized from the financial document Dench had shown her in the parking garage. The same holding company, the same named officer, Aldrin Ferris. "It's all here," Sera said. She was aware that her voice was flat, not because she wasn't feeling the weight of it, but because the weight of it was too large for a specific tone. 3 years of falsified decommission records. The weapons are sold through a civilian network. The money goes to Ferris. Dench moved to stand beside her and looked at the screen. He read for about 30 seconds, then said, "We need a forensic copy of this entire file. Right now, before anything else." "There's something else," Sera said. She had kept reading while Dench was looking at the screen. The final section of Teal's report, a section labeled Distribution Record, showed that Teal had not kept this document only to himself. He had made copies, 3 of them, distributed 18 months ago to 3 separate recipients, 1 Federal Oversight Contact, 1 DoD Inspector General's Office, and 1 recipient listed only by a case reference number she didn't recognize. "He already sent this to the IG's office," she said. Caro came forward. 18 months ago? "Yes." A pause. "Then either the report never arrived or it arrived and was buried." Sera looked at the case reference number on the 3rd distribution. "Or the 3rd recipient is the reason it's still in this system. Someone else received a copy and held it here as insurance." Reyes had connected a forensic drive to the terminal and was pulling the full copy. The progress bar on the screen moved steadily. Sera kept reading, and at the very end of the document, after the reconciliation tables, after Teal's analysis, after the distribution record, there was a single page that had no header and no numbering. It was a list of names, not transaction codes, actual names, 12 of them. Beside each name was a title or position and a date. She read the list from the top. The fourth name was Brennan Louth, Hospital Director, Harlow Veterans Medical Center. The seventh name was Warren Stahl, Police Commander, Calverton PD. The 11th name was Garrett Solon, Deputy Commander, Calverton PD, the man who had appeared at the press conference that morning in Stahl's absence. And the 12th name, at the bottom of the list, was Aldrin Ferris, Infrastructure Consultant. No date beside his name, just a single notation, Principal. There's a list, Sera said. 12 names. Ferris is at the bottom. Caro read it over her shoulder. The room was quiet except for the server hum and the progress indicator on the forensic drive. Solon, Caro said. She said it quietly, but with the quality of someone who has just had a map redrawn in front of them. Solon was at the press conference this morning. He's been handling the public response to Molt's arrest. He's on the list. Which means he's known since this morning that we have Molt in custody, and he's been managing the narrative from inside the department. Caro straightened. Reyes, how long on the copy? 4 minutes. We need to call this in and get Solon picked up before he knows we have the list. Caro moved to the door and keyed her radio. Sera heard her relaying the name and position in clipped shorthand. 3 minutes and 40 seconds later, the forensic drive finished its transfer. Reyes pulled it, sealed it in an evidence bag, and handed it to Dench, who put it in the briefcase and locked it with the particular care of someone who understood exactly what they were holding. Sera logged out of this terminal. She stood up and her back was stiff from sitting at the wrong angle, and she noticed distantly that her hands were very slightly unsteady, not from fear, but from sustained adrenaline, the body's accounting system running slightly behind the situation. She pressed both palms flat against the top of the server terminal for a moment and breathed evenly. We need to get to Teal, she said. He built this. He deserves to know it's been recovered. We'll get to him, Caro said, but there's a sequence problem. She turned from the door. Ferris, we have the financial trail. We have the list. We have Teal's report. What we don't have yet is the mechanism. The direct evidentiary link between Ferris and the specific decisions to route patients to Harlow and use Molt as the enforcement arm. The financial evidence establishes the motive and the benefit. But a competent defense will argue that Ferris was a passive beneficiary of decisions made by Stahl and Louth without his direction. Sera looked at her. You need someone to directly connect him to the operational decisions. We need communications, emails, texts, call logs showing that Ferris directed Stahl or Louth to take specific actions. Caro met her eyes. Louth's office. The fourth floor of Harlow was more active than the basement had been. Morning rounds were moving through the clinical sections, and the administrative corridor that led to Louth's office had 3 people in it, a department coordinator, a billing specialist, and a man Sera didn't recognize who was standing outside the director's suite with his arms at his sides and the stillness of someone waiting for something specific. Reyes stopped at the corner of the corridor and looked at Caro. Caro looked at the man outside Louth's office. Is that a security contractor? Sera looked. The man was not in a hospital uniform. He was in a plain jacket over a collared shirt, and he had the kind of shoes that were designed to look civilian, but had a sole thickness that suggested outdoor use. He also had an earpiece. Not hospital security, she said. Hospital security wears the gray vest. Caro moved her hand slightly, and Reyes shifted position. Not dramatically, not in a way that would register to anyone watching casually, but enough that he now had a clear angle on the man's profile. Ferris, Sera said quietly. He already has someone here. Which means he knows the arrest happened and he's not waiting to see how it develops. They could not approach Louth's office through the main corridor without passing the man in the plain jacket. They could not go around. The administrative suite had only one entrance on this floor. They could request backup and wait, but waiting gave Ferris's operative time to do whatever he had been sent here to do. Caro made a decision in about 4 seconds, which was consistent with every decision Sera had seen her make. Reyes, you and Dench go around through maintenance access and come in through the suite's secondary door. It connects to the records annex. I know it's on the schematic. She looked at Sera. You and I are going to walk past him. He'll recognize federal credentials. Yes, that's the point. Caro straightened her jacket. We want him to know we're here. We want him to make a decision in real time with incomplete information. People make mistakes when they're improvising. She was right. Sera had seen that principle proven in environments far less controlled than this corridor, under conditions where the consequences of a wrong improvisation were measured in something more final than legal exposure. They walked. The man outside Louth's office watched them come down the corridor with the practiced blankness of someone trained to observe without reacting. When they were 10 feet away, his eyes went to Caro's jacket, specifically to the federal designation on the chest. And something happened behind his expression. Not panic, more like the rapid reassessment of a situation whose parameters had just shifted. "Federal agent," Caro said, reaching him, "I need to know why you're standing outside a hospital administrative suite." "Private security," the man said. "My client has a consultation with the director this morning." "Your client's name?" "A beat." "Aldrin Ferris." "And Mr. Ferris is currently inside." The beat before the man's answer was a quarter-second too long. He stepped out. Caro looked at the door, then at the man. "Step away from the door." He didn't move immediately, which was a mistake, and then he did, which was too late to correct it. Caro had her credentials in his line of sight, and her body between him and the door before he'd finished the movement, and Sera pushed the door open and went in. The director's suite was 2 rooms, a reception area and an inner office. The reception area was empty. The inner office door was partially open, and through it came the sound of a filing cabinet drawer closing. She went through the door. Brennan Louth was standing at the filing cabinet against the left wall with a folder in one hand and an expression on his face that completed several things she had only suspected until now. He looked at her the way you look at something you have been told is not possible, and then you see it anyway, and your mind spends a half-second insisting on the impossible before conceding to the evidence. "Ms. Voss," he said. His voice was almost steady. "Director." She scanned the room. Desk, filing cabinet, Louth, no one else. On the desk was his personal laptop, open and running, with a file transfer dialog visible on the screen. "Step away from the cabinet." He didn't move. "You've been suspended. You have no authority to—" "The suspension is a federal matter under review." She moved toward him, not fast, not aggressive, but with the specific directness of someone who is done negotiating the terms of the room. "Step away." He stepped away. His hand was still on the folder. She looked at the folder and then at the filing cabinet drawer, which had been in the section marked Administrative Contracts, External Consultancy. She looked at the laptop screen. The file transfer was to an external drive that was plugged into the side of the machine. "What's on this drive?" she asked. Louth's jaw moved. "Administrative records." "Specific records." He didn't answer. Caro came through the inner office door behind Sera. She took in the room in one sweep and went directly to the laptop. She looked at the transfer dialog, then at the external drive, then at Louth. "What were you deleting?" "I wasn't deleting anything. I was organizing." "The transfer is to an external drive, not within the system." Caro reached past him and ejected the drive without completing the transfer. "Sit down, Director." Louth sat. He set the folder on the desk and put his hands flat beside it, and Sera looked at his hands and thought about the hands folded on the desk posture from her suspension meeting, and thought that whatever this man had told himself about what he was doing, whatever logic he had constructed to make it livable, it was visibly coming apart in this room at this moment. "The communications," Caro said, "between you and Aldrin Ferris. We have the financial trail and we have the list. We need the communications that show his direction of operational decisions." Louth said nothing. "Director?" Caro's voice didn't sharpen. It stayed even, which was somehow more effective. "We have 12 names on a document recovered from this facility's server archive. Your name is number 4. Right now, that means you are one of 12 people with equal evidentiary exposure. That is not a favorable position." She paused. "It is also not the only position available to you." Louth looked at the desk surface. The muscles in his jaw were working. Sera watched him and said nothing. She understood that there were moments where adding a voice was the wrong move, where the silence was doing more work than any words could. Finally, Louth said, "He contacted me through a secure messaging application. Everything is on the phone." He reached toward his jacket pocket slowly. "Slowly," Caro said. He produced a phone. A personal one, such that not the hospital-issued device. He set it on the desk. "The application uses rotating encryption keys, but I kept the session archive. I didn't delete it." Why not? Sera asked. Louth looked at her. He held her gaze for the first time in this whole encounter, and she saw something in it that she hadn't expected. Not remorse exactly, but something adjacent to it. The exhaustion of a person who has been carrying something heavy for too long and has reached the point where setting it down feels more urgent than what happens afterward. Because I needed it, he said, in case he decided I was expendable. The session archive on Louth's phone contained 14 months of communications between Louth and a contact listed as AF, text messages, voice notes, and document transfers conducted through an encrypted platform that had been designed for corporate confidentiality but was evidently serving a different purpose here. Reyes processed the phone on site with a field extraction kit, while Dench stood at the door and Caro and Sera read the extracted messages on a tablet as they populated. The messages were not subtle. AF, who from context was clearly Ferris, had directed Louth with specificity. Which patients to flag, which records to revise, when to grant Molt access to specific floors, when to activate the privacy transfer protocol that had moved Teal to the private clinic, and 4 months ago a message that read, "The Voss woman is a problem. She needs to be managed out before she finds the server archive. Use the PD liaison mechanism." Louth had replied, "Done." Sera read the message twice. She did not feel the anger that might have been the expected response. What she felt was something more structural, the specific, grounded satisfaction of a pattern that has been suspected for a long time, finally revealing its complete shape. The message removed every remaining ambiguity. Ferris had known about her specifically, had directed her removal specifically. "That's direct operational control," Caro said. "That's not passive benefit." She looked at Dench. "We need an arrest warrant for Ferris. Now. Today." Dench was already on his radio. Sera set the tablet down. Her back was still stiff. She had been awake for what was probably 30 hours, accounting for the 4 hours of hotel sleep that had felt like nothing. The server room, the corridor confrontation, the director's office. The sequence had moved fast enough that the fatigue had stayed in the background where she'd been pushing it. But now that there was a gap in the action, her body was presenting its accounting. She sat in one of the chairs against the wall of Louth's outer office and let herself land for a moment. Caro came and stood near her. "You should eat something. Later." "That's not a medical recommendation, that's—" "I know." Sera looked up. "Is Stahl still dark?" "His car was found at a rest stop off the Dunmore Highway 40 minutes ago. He was in it." A pause. "Alive. He turned himself into the county sheriff's office. He's asking for a federal prosecutor. He's going to cooperate. He's going to try to negotiate cooperation in exchange for reduced exposure. Whether he has enough to trade on is the question." Caro sat in the other chair. "Ferris has been running this for at least 3 years. If Stahl can corroborate the communications on the phone—" "He can," Sera said, "because the messages show Stahl was copied on several of the operational decisions. He'll recognize the references." Caro nodded, then, in a different tone, less operational, more direct. "When Molt said you have no idea what you just started, do you think he knew about Ferris?" Sera considered it. "I think Molt knew there was someone above Stahl. I don't think he knew the full scope. People at Molt's level aren't told more than they need to do their job. Compartmentalization. It's efficient, until the compartment breaks open." She paused. "He was trying to intimidate me with the idea that the network was bigger than I could handle. He wasn't wrong about the size of it. He was wrong about who I'd hand it to." Caro almost smiled. "The FBI email you sent from your car in the parking structure. I had a contact from my Navy rotation. I didn't know if it would go anywhere." "It went everywhere," Caro said. "You sent that email, and within 48 hours we had a team reviewing the Calverton-Aldrin connection that we'd been building from a different angle for 7 months. You were the piece that tied the hospital end to the financial end." She paused. "We couldn't have built the warrant for Molt's arrest without your documentation." Sera looked at the tablet on the desk, at the photograph of the message directing her removal. "The Voss woman is a problem." She thought about Louth reading that message and typing "done" in response. She thought about the suspension letter in the sealed envelope, the badge she'd set on the counter, the walk past Molt standing at the end of the corridor. She had not been afraid exactly. She had been angry in the cold, sustaining ways she got angry at things that were wrong and should not be allowed to remain wrong. "There's still Ferris," she said. "The warrant is being drafted." And there's still the question of what happened to the copies Teal sent. The IG report that arrived 18 months ago and apparently went nowhere. Caro's expression shifted slightly. Not evasive, but careful. That's a separate investigation. The IG's office has a review process, and it's possible the report was received and placed in a queue that wasn't prioritized. It's also possible it was intercepted. Intercepted by whom? That's what we need to determine. Caro stood up. One thing at a time. But Sera was already thinking about the third distribution on Teal's list, the one with only a case reference number. Whoever had received that copy had held on to it for 18 months without acting on it, or had acted on it in some way she couldn't yet trace. That recipient was still unidentified, and in a case where the network was large enough to have its own intake system and its own enforcement arm and its own hospital director, an unidentified recipient with a copy of the core evidence was not a detail she could file under one thing at a time. Reyes appeared in the doorway. "We have a problem." Caro turned. "The warrant for Ferris." Reyes looked at Dench, then at Caro. "We sent a team to his residence and his registered office. He's not at either location." "Since when?" "His housekeeper says he left with a bag this morning. She thought it was a business trip. She didn't think anything of it." Sera stood up. "He ran," she said. "Or he's running," Reyes said. "There's a difference. Running implies a destination. His financial profile shows 3 wire transfers in the last 6 hours. 2 domestic, 1 international. The international one went to an account in a jurisdiction without an extradition treaty." "He's moving money," Caro said, "which means he knows the financial trail is compromised and he's trying to get ahead of the asset freeze. If he gets the international transfer completed before we can get a freeze order..." "How much?" Sera asked. Reyes looked at his phone. "The international transfer is for $4.7 million. The room was quiet. $4.7 million was not the entirety of a 3-year weapons diversion operation. It was a fraction, a selected fraction, which meant Ferris had already made decisions about what he could move and what he would leave behind. He was not panicking. He was executing a contingency plan that had been prepared in advance. Caro was already on her radio. Sera was already calculating. Ferris had left his residence this morning. The team had been at the hospital since 7. The international wire had been initiated, but wire transfers at that value required authorization steps that created time delays. Depending on the institution and the jurisdiction, the transfer might not settle for several hours. "The account receiving the international transfer," she said. "Which institution?" Reyes looked at his phone again and read a name. Sera knew it. Not well. It was the kind of institution you encountered in the background of financial compliance training, the kind that existed in the part of the international banking system that was technically legal and practically designed for people who wanted distance between their money and their jurisdiction. "There's a compliance hold protocol for flagged transfers to that category of institution," she said. "The FBI's Financial Crimes Division can trigger a 72-hour administrative hold on the transfer through SWIFT. It won't freeze the account, but it will delay settlement long enough for a formal freeze order to go through the right channels." Caro stopped mid-transmission and looked at her. "You know that process?" "My Navy rotation included a financial intelligence attachment. 6 months. I worked with the DoD's forensic accounting team on contractor fraud cases." She paused. "I know the process. It requires a field agent certification and a case number." "You have the case number. I have the certification." Caro looked at Reyes. "Get me a secure line to the financial crimes duty officer." Reyes was moving before she finished the sentence, but Sera was looking at the window. The morning light through the administrative suite's east-facing window was the particular flat gray of a Calverton winter day, and outside the hospital, the city was doing what cities do, moving without knowing what was happening inside these rooms, without knowing that the network that had been quietly running through its institutions for 3 years was currently being dismantled floor by floor, office by office, server rack by server rack. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Unknown number, local area code. She answered. A voice she did not recognize, male, controlled, with the careful diction of someone choosing every word, said, "Ms. Voss, this is a courtesy call. You've done very thorough work this morning, but there are aspects of the situation that the FBI isn't aware of yet, and I think you and I should have a conversation before those aspects become uncontrolled." She kept her voice entirely level. "Who is this?" Someone who received a copy of a certain document 18 months ago and chose to hold it rather than act on it. I think you understand the reference. The third name on Teal's distribution list, the unidentified recipient. I understand the reference, she said. Good. Then you understand that the copy I hold contains material that is not present in the version stored on the Harlow server. Teal prepared two versions, one that went into the archive and one that he gave directly to me. The version I have names additional individuals, people whose positions are significantly more protected than Ferris's. Sera held the phone and felt the weight of the statement settle. She looked at Caro, who had noticed her stillness and was watching. Where do you want to meet? She asked. Calverton Central Library, second floor, research section, 45 minutes. The line went dead. She lowered the phone and looked at Caro and said, There's a second version of Teal's document, with names that aren't on the list we recovered. Caro's expression moved through several things rapidly and landed on something hard and focused. The third distribution. The recipient just called me. He wants to meet. We can trace the call. He knows that. Sera looked at the phone in her hand. He called anyway, which means he's not hiding. He's negotiating. Or setting a trap. She thought about the voice, the careful diction, the specific phrase, courtesy call. The willingness to identify himself by his connection to Teal's document on a line he knew was potentially monitored. A man setting a trap doesn't volunteer information that makes him traceable. A man negotiating does. He's not Ferris's person, she said. If he were, he wouldn't be calling me. He'd be calling Ferris. Caro held her gaze for 2 seconds. 45 minutes. Yes. I need a team staged outside the library before you go in. I know. And Sera. Caro's voice dropped to the register it went to when she was being precise rather than official. If the second document names people above Ferris's level, people in protected positions, then this case just went somewhere that requires authorizations I don't currently have. Sera understood what she was saying. This was no longer a regional corruption case with a federal enforcement wrapper. If the second document went higher than Ferris, if it reached into federal oversight structures, DoD contracting boards, elected positions, then the institutional complexity became something qualitatively different from what they had been managing until now. Then we need to know what's in it before we can decide who needs to authorize what, Sera said. She picked up her jacket, the server room, the director's office, the 12 names, the financial trace, the phone call from a man who had been sitting on a second version of the document for 18 months and had chosen now, exactly now, the morning after Molt's arrest, to surface. Everything had been building towards something she hadn't yet seen clearly. She was 45 minutes from seeing it. The Calverton Central Library occupied a full city block on Mercer Street, a WPA-era building with stone facades and tall, narrow windows that had been retrofitted with modern glass in the 90s and never quite recovered the dignity of the original design. The second-floor research section was accessible by a wide central staircase or a back elevator, and it occupied the rear half of the building, reading tables, reference shelves, a row of study carrels along the east wall that looked out over a parking structure. Sera arrived 11 minutes early. She did this deliberately, not because she expected the man to be there already, but because she wanted the room before he did. She wanted to know the exits, the sight lines, the location of the library's security desk relative to the staircase. She wanted to be sitting when he arrived, not entering when he was already seated, which was a small advantage and the kind of small advantage that had mattered in the past. Caro had 3 agents in the building, one at the ground floor entrance, one in the periodicals section on the first floor, one in a reading carrel near the east window where he had a line of sight to the research section's main approach. They were not in position to intervene quickly if something went wrong, which was a calculation Sera had made and accepted. The man on the phone had surfaced voluntarily on a traceable line. The risk profile was manageable. She sat at a table near the center of the research section, where she could see both the staircase and the elevator, and she put her phone face down on the table and waited. He arrived at 3 minutes past the agreed time, which felt like a statement. Not the tardiness of someone who didn't take the meeting seriously, but the deliberate 3-minute delay of someone who wanted to see if she'd sent anyone ahead and had spent those extra minutes watching the room from the staircase landing. He was in his late 50s, with the careful, economical appearance of a man who had spent a career in institutional environments and had learned to be unmemorable by design. Medium height, gray suit, glasses he didn't seem to need based on the way his eyes tracked the room before he focused on her. He carried a leather document case that was old enough to be worn at the corners. He sat across from her without extending a hand or offering a name. "You were early," he said. "Habit," she said. "Military." "Does it matter?" He considered her for a moment. Up close, there was something behind the careful exterior that she hadn't heard on the phone, a tiredness that went past physical. The specific exhaustion of someone who has been holding something for a long time and has become, in the holding, diminished by it. "My name is Roland Fitch," he said. 18 months ago, I was a senior contracts auditor with the DoD's Office of Inspector General. I received Marcus Teal's report through an encrypted channel he'd established through a whistleblower protocol. I reviewed it over 4 days and concluded it was credible. "And then you held it," Sera said. "And then my supervisor called me into his office and told me the Aldrin Supply Group audit had been deferred to a joint congressional committee review and that any field-level action on related reports would require authorization at the deputy IG level." He set the document case on the table. His exact words were, "This one goes up, not out," which, in the language of the office, meant that someone above our pay grade had decided the disposition. "Who was your supervisor?" Fitch looked at the case. His name was Dale Merrow, Deputy Inspector General for Contracts and Procurement. He retired 14 months ago, early, at 61, with a full package. He now consults for a federal infrastructure advisory firm. A pause. "The firm's client list is not public, but I know one of its clients is a holding company registered in the name of a family trust." Sera felt the shape of it. Ferris's trust. "I can't confirm that directly, but the timeline of Merrow's retirement and the incorporation of the advisory firm correlates precisely with the period when the financial transfers through Ferris's holding company accelerated." He unlatched the document case. "After Merrow's retirement, I was reassigned to a different division. The Teal report was officially logged as received, pending committee referral, and then nothing. No committee action, no acknowledgement. It just sat." "And you kept your copy?" "I kept my copy because I couldn't prove Merrow had buried it deliberately. I couldn't prove anything except that a credible report had been received and had effectively disappeared. I needed something to come in from the outside to give the copy meaning, an independent thread that corroborated Teal's findings without tracing back to me." He looked at her steadily. Molt's arrest was that thread. Sera understood. Fitch had been waiting for someone else to break the surface so he could add his documentation without being the origin point of an allegation that, without corroboration, would have been his word against a former deputy IG and whatever protection Ferris's network could provide. "The second version of the document," she said. "You said it contains names that aren't in the server archive." Fitch reached into the document case and produced a sealed envelope. He set it on the table between them. Teal prepared 2 versions. The one in the server archive is the version he filed for institutional record, complete on the financial and inventory evidence, but deliberately limited on the personnel list. He sent me the full version. He looked at the envelope. The full version names Dale Merrow. It names 2 members of a congressional subcommittee that had oversight authority for the KL-7 contract vehicle, and it names the chair of the Calverton Regional Hospital Authority Board. Not Ferris? Ferris is named in both versions, but in the full version he's identified not as principal, as intermediary. Sera looked at the envelope. "Who's above him?" "Open it," Fitch said. She reached for the envelope and stopped. She thought about Caro's comment in the hospital office. "This case just went somewhere that requires authorizations I don't currently have." She thought about the agents positioned in this building right now, with their current authorization level and their current case scope. "I need to bring in the lead agent on the current operation before I open this," she said. Fitch nodded, as if he had expected this and had prepared himself for it. "I assumed as much." She texted Caro a single word. "Now." Caro came up the staircase with Dench 2 minutes later, which meant she'd been closer than the first floor. She sat at the table, looked at Fitch, and listened without interrupting while he repeated what he had told Sera. She did not look at the envelope until he had finished. Then she looked at Sera. "Do you want to open it, or should I?" she asked. "You should," Sera said. Caro opened it. She read the contents, 8 pages, dense with names, dates, financial references, and annotated transaction data. with the stillness of someone who has trained themselves to show nothing while processing significant information. Dench read over her shoulder. His expression moved through two phases and settled on something that Sera read as controlled alarm. When Caro finished, she set the pages on the table and said, "I need to make a call." She went to the far end of the research section, near the East Carrolls, and spoke on her phone for approximately 6 minutes. Sera watched Dench, who was rereading the second page of the document with the specific attention of someone identifying a problem. "Marrow, I expected," Dench said quietly. "The subcommittee members are manageable, politically difficult, but the evidentiary chain is clear." He looked at the last page. "This one." He pointed to the final name on the document. Sera leaned forward and read it. She did not know the name personally, but she knew the position. A senior DoD procurement official who served as the departmental liaison to the Congressional Subcommittee with KL7 Oversight Authority. A career official, not a political appointee, which meant they had survived across multiple administrations by being useful and uncontroversial and very, very careful about their visible connections. If Teal's evidence connected this official to the weapons diversion, not just as an oversight failure, but as a deliberate participant, then the case had reached a level of institutional complexity that would require DoD Office of General Counsel involvement, likely congressional notification, and a level of coordination between agencies that typically took months to arrange properly. Ferris was still in the wind. Stahl was in county custody negotiating his cooperation. Molt was in federal detention with his attorney and his silence. Louth was in an interview room at the federal field office. And the man who was above Ferris, whose name was on this final page, was presumably at his desk in a federal building somewhere, doing whatever career DoD officials do on Wednesday mornings, with no indication yet that the thread Teal had pulled 18 months ago had finally reached him. Caro came back to the table. She sat down. She looked at Fitch. "I need you to come with us," she said. "Not in custody, as a cooperating witness. Your copy of this document, combined with your testimony regarding Marrow's handling of the original report, is critical to the chain of custody on the evidence." "I understand," Fitch said. He closed the document case with the deliberateness of a man who has made a decision he can't reverse and has made his peace with that. "I've been ready for this conversation for 14 months. I just needed someone to have it with." He stood. Sera stood. Caro was already texting, and Dench had the evidence bag open for the document. It was then that the agent in the periodicals section came up the staircase faster than a man should need to move in a library. And the look on his face when he reached the second floor was the specific look of someone delivering information that changes the immediate situation. "Ferris," he said, slightly breathless. "We have a location." But he had not left Calverton. This was the first surprise, and it recalibrated several assumptions Sera had been running. A man executing a flight contingency, moving money internationally, going dark, should have left the city the moment the wire transfers were initiated. The fact that he hadn't meant either that he had a specific reason to stay, or that something had prevented him from going. The location the agent had on his phone was a commercial property in the Calverton waterfront district, a renovated warehouse that had been converted to private office suites in the mid-2010s. The property was registered to a holding company. The holding company, when Reyes ran it against the financial documents from the morning, connected back through two intermediary entities to the same corporate structure as Aldrin Supply Group. Ferris had been at his own property the entire time. Caro absorbed this in the car, with Dench and Sera in the back seat, and two more federal vehicles running parallel through different streets. She said, "He's not running, he's waiting." "For what?" Dench asked. "That's the question." She looked at her phone. "The wire transfer. The international one. What's the status?" Reyes, in the front seat, checked his screen. "The compliance hold was triggered 40 minutes ago. Settlement is suspended pending review." "So he knows the money didn't move." "He should know by now, yes." Caro looked out the window. The waterfront district was industrial residential on the edges, and the warehouse conversion was at the intersection of two commercial blocks, with a loading dock on its north face and a glass-fronted reception entrance on the south. There were two vehicles parked outside that Reyes could run plates on while they staged. "He's not running and he's not waiting for the money," Sera said. "He's waiting for someone." Caro looked at her. "The third wire transfer," Sera said. You said 2 domestic, 1 international. The international is frozen. What were the 2 domestic transfers? Reyes pulled up the financial trace again. First domestic transfer, 2.1 million, to an account registered to a Legal Services LLC. Second domestic, he paused. Second domestic is 1.3 million, to an account I'm not finding a registration for in the standard databases. Run it against the document Fitch gave us, Sera said. The transaction codes in Teal's reconciliation. Reyes typed. He looked at the screen. He looked at Caro. It matches a transaction code from the Teal document, the same code that Teal identified as routing to the senior DoD official. The car was quiet. He's paying someone to do something, Sera said. Right now, today. To do what? Dench said. She looked at him. What's the one thing that would protect Ferris even if we have the Teal document, the server archive, the phone messages, and Fitch's testimony? Dench started to answer and then stopped. If the primary evidence chain is compromised, Sera said, if something happens to the forensic drive, if the server archive becomes inaccessible because the hardware is damaged or the chain of custody is broken, if Fitch's testimony is discredited by evidence of his own prior misconduct, real or fabricated. The drive is at the federal field office, Dench said. He reached for his radio. What came back from the field office was not what anyone wanted to hear. The agent on duty reported that 40 minutes ago, a man presenting credentials from the DoD Office of Inspector General had arrived at the field office requesting access to the evidence processing room for an urgent chain of custody verification related to the Harlow case. Standard protocol required 2-agent verification for access to active evidence. The duty agent had begun the verification process and was waiting for a second agent to arrive. The man with the OIG credentials was still in the building. Dench said, "Lock the evidence room. Do not give that man access to anything. Lock the building and hold him for identification." His voice was precise and without inflection, the tone of someone giving instructions they hope will arrive in time. Caro had already redirected 2 of the parallel vehicles to the field office. She looked at Sera. "We split. I go to the field office. You go to the warehouse. I'm not a federal agent. You're a cooperating operative with active credentials from this operation." Caro handed her a radio. "Reyes stays with you. Dench goes to the field office with me." She looked at Reyes. "You do not go in without backup confirmation. You hold position and observe. If Ferris moves, you follow. You do not approach alone." Reyes nodded. Sera took the radio. The car divided at the next intersection, and she was in a different vehicle heading toward the waterfront with Reyes and 1 other agent, and she was thinking about the man at the field office with the OIG credentials, and whether the credentials were real or fabricated, and whether it mattered. Because either way, Ferris had paid someone to do something to the evidence chain while the investigation was focused on his location. It was a good move. She could acknowledge that without admiring it. The warehouse on the waterfront sat between a marine supply company and a vacant commercial lot, and from the parking structure across the street, Reyes had a clear sightline to both the north and south entrances. They had been staged for 8 minutes when one of the south entrance doors opened and a man came out. Not Ferris. The man was younger, in a jacket, moving fast toward one of the parked vehicles. "That's not him," Reyes said. "No, but he's leaving." Sera watched the man reach the vehicle, get in, and pull out. "One person just left, which means Ferris knows something has changed." "The transfer," Reyes said. "If his person at the field office signaled that the access attempt failed." "He's not running yet," Sera said. She was watching the south entrance, no further movement. "He's deciding." Her radio clicked. Caro's voice compressed and fast. The OIG credentials were fabricated. The man in the field office is in custody. The evidence room was not accessed. The drive is secure. Sera exhaled. "Copy. We have eyes on the waterfront property. 1 individual just departed. Target still appears to be inside. We have a tactical team inbound. ETA 7 minutes. Hold position." 7 minutes. She watched the building. On the 2nd minute, something she hadn't expected happened. The glass-fronted reception entrance on the south side opened again, and this time the man who came through it was not a courier or an assistant or anyone else. He was in his mid-60s, with the physical carriage of someone who had been fit earlier in life and had retained the posture if not the condition. And he was carrying a briefcase and moving toward the remaining vehicle outside with the deliberate pace of someone who had made a calculation. Reyes had his radio up immediately. Target is mobile, south entrance, on foot toward the vehicle. If he gets in the vehicle, we lose the inside of the building. Caro's response, do not approach. Reyes looked at Sera. She was already out of the vehicle. She did not run. Running attracted exactly the wrong kind of attention, and the distance between the parking structure and the south entrance of the warehouse was only 40 meters across the street. She walked it at the pace of someone with somewhere to be, which she had, and she reached the sidewalk in front of the warehouse just as Aldrin Ferris reached his vehicle. He saw her before she spoke. He stopped. She stopped. For a moment, the two of them stood on the Calverton waterfront with the industrial smell of the river district around them, and the sound of traffic on the cross street, and the specific silence of a situation that has arrived at its decisive point. Ferris looked at her with the assessment of a man who has spent 30 years evaluating risk and making decisions based on incomplete information. He took in the federal credentials on her jacket, the radio in her hand, the absence of anyone else visibly present. She watched him calculate. Ms. Voss, he said. He had a low, deliberate voice, the voice of someone who had conducted many conversations in which tone was more important than content. Mr. Ferris, you've had a very productive morning. The morning's not over. He looked at the vehicle, then back at her. His hand was on the door handle, but he hadn't opened it, which meant the calculation was still running. I want you to understand something. What you've uncovered at Harlow is real. I won't insult you by denying the financial structure, but the people above me, the ones on the document your friend Fitch has been sitting on, they are not people who face consequences the way Stahl faces consequences, the way Louth will. He paused. I can give you those people. In exchange for... You should speak to Agent Caro about that, Sera said. She's the one with the authority to discuss it. I'm speaking to you. I know. She held his gaze. That's not an accident, is it? You expected to find someone with less authority here, someone you could negotiate with before the people with actual authority arrived. Something shifted in his expression, not quite respect, but the acknowledgement of a correct read. The people on Fitch's document, she said, if the evidence is solid, and Teal made sure it was solid, then they face consequences regardless of what you offer. The question is whether you face them from a cooperation position or a non-cooperation position. That's a real question, but it's not one I can answer for you. Ferris stood at his vehicle door for 4 seconds. Then he took his hand off the handle and turned to face her fully. The team that's coming, he said. How far out? Close enough, she said. He looked at her for another moment. Then he set his briefcase on the hood of the vehicle, not aggressively, just setting it down, and put his hands in his jacket pockets and looked out at the waterfront. She had expected him to run, or to try harder to negotiate, or to make a phone call. She had not expected him to simply stand there, looking at the river, with the particular stillness of a man who has arrived at the end of a very long run and found that the energy required to continue is no longer available. She stood 2 meters away and said nothing. The tactical team arrived 4 minutes later, and Reyes came across the street, and 2 other agents moved from positions she hadn't known they'd taken up, and the arrest was not dramatic. There was no resistance. Ferris turned when asked, put his hands where required, and was processed with the quiet efficiency of a federal arrest that has been prepared correctly. She watched it happen. The briefcase on the hood of the vehicle was logged as evidence by an agent with a camera and evidence bags, and when it was opened, it contained a laptop, a portable hard drive, 3 phones, and a folder of printed documents. The printed documents were, at a glance, communications between Ferris and the individuals on Fitch's expanded list, communications that Ferris had apparently intended to use as his own leverage, either to negotiate with the FBI or to ensure that if he went down, he didn't go down alone. He had been planning to cooperate. He had just wanted to do it on his own timeline, with his own materials, rather than theirs. The forensic team would spend weeks going through what was in that briefcase. Sera already knew, standing in the waterfront light, that it was going to be enough. She was in the federal field office conference room at 3 in the afternoon, drinking coffee that was significantly better than hospital coffee, when Caro came in and sat across from her and said, Stahl gave a full statement. He's been talking for 4 hours. He corroborates everything, the routing operation, Molt's instructions, Ferris's direction of specific decisions. He also confirmed that Marrow at the IG's office received the Teal report and called Ferris directly. A pause. Marrow is being picked up in Washington right now. The subcommittee members? That's a coordination process. It involves the congressional notification protocol, and it's going to take longer, but the evidence doesn't expire. Carol wrapped both hands around her own coffee cup. Ferris is cooperating, fully. His attorney arrived 40 minutes after the arrest and apparently told him that the evidence posture left no viable alternative. He already knew that, Sera said. That's why he was standing at the waterfront. Probably. Carol looked at her. He confirmed the name of the DOD official, and he has documentation from his own briefcase that shows direct coordination. The official's exposure is significant. What happens to Teal? He's been brought to a proper medical facility. His sedation is being reversed under supervision. He's expected to be conscious and functional by this evening. Caro paused. He's going to want to know what happened to the file. Tell him it's recovered. Tell him it worked. Caro nodded. Then she said, "The hospital board has been notified of Louth's arrest and the federal investigation. The administrative suspension on your credentials is being formally rescinded. The board is also being notified that several administrative appointments at Harlow are under review, given the extent of Louth's cooperation with the scheme." Sera held her coffee cup. Outside the conference room window, the Calverton afternoon was flat and gray and ordinary, the way afternoons were in cities where significant things had just happened and the city itself didn't know yet. "The veterans," she said, "Garrett, Pruitt, their records were altered. We know. Their cases are being flagged for review by the Military Records Correction Board. It's a process. It's not fast. But the altered records are now evidence in a federal case, which means they can't be re-altered, and the correction process has a clear path." Sera nodded. It wasn't enough. It was nowhere near enough for what those men had been put through, but it was the beginning of something that could, with time and the right institutional pressure, become sufficient. She thought about Lewis Garrett, admitted with restraint bruising that someone had erased from his chart. She thought about Darnell Pruitt, transferred before he could be asked anything useful. She thought about Marcus Teal, awake in the dark watching the door of his hospital room, having carried an 18-month-old document and its weight and its danger through an entire year and a half of silence. They had all been managed, all been handled, all been made smaller by a system that had counted on their smallness. None of them had been small. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. It was a number she didn't recognize, but the area code was local, and she answered because local numbers had been significant today. The voice on the other end was Marcus Teal, who was slightly rough from the sedation reversal, and he did not say much. He was not, she understood from 30 seconds of conversation, a man who said much when a little was sufficient. He said, "They told me you found it." "You hit it well," she said. "Not well enough, apparently. Well enough that it lasted until the right moment." A pause. "The list. The real one. It's in federal hands. The process is moving." Another pause. "The people on it, they're going to say it was Ferris, that everything ran through him, and above him, no one knew." "They might say that," she said. "The documentation says otherwise." "Documentation doesn't always—" "I know," she said. "But this documentation was prepared by a Marine Corps logistics officer who apparently decided that if he was going to do it, he was going to do it so thoroughly that there wasn't a version of events that didn't include the evidence." So, a sound on the other end that might have been an exhale or might have been something adjacent to a laugh. "How long before they try to minimize it?" "Longer than it used to be," she said, "because it's not just in one place anymore." He understood what she meant. The evidence was distributed. The server archive, Fitch's physical copy, the documents from Ferris's briefcase, Stahl's statement, Louth's phone. You could not excise it from one location and have it disappear. "Thank you," he said. Then, before she could respond, "Don't say it was your job. It wasn't. Not this part." She didn't say it was her job. She said, "Rest. The medical team will check on you at 6. She hung up. Caro was watching her from across the table with the look she sometimes had, the one that was not quite professional and not quite personal, but existed in the narrow space between. "There's one more thing you should know," Caro said. She set her coffee down. "Molt. His attorney has been negotiating all day. This afternoon they presented a proffer." "He's cooperating?" He's offering to corroborate the routing operation in exchange for consideration on the attempted murder charge. Caro met her eyes. His testimony would specifically name Stahl as the person who ordered him to enter room 412. Not Ferris. Stahl gave the direct order. Ferris authorized it through the channel on Louth's phone, but the operational instruction came from Stahl. Sera processed this. Does accepting the proffer reduce his exposure significantly? Less than he wants. The recording from room 412 is what it is. His corroboration on Stahl helps the case against Stahl, but it doesn't remove what Molt did. Caro paused. The federal prosecutor's position is that cooperation gets considered at sentencing, not at the charge level. Good, Sera said. She meant it without heat. Not as punishment for its own sake, but as the correct outcome of a clear accounting. Molt had entered a room intending to kill someone, and the charge should reflect what he had intended, regardless of what he was prepared to say afterward. She finished her coffee. Outside the conference room, the federal field office was doing what field offices did after a major operational day. The contained, deliberate work of processing what had been gathered, building the evidentiary structure that would move from arrest to charge to prosecution. People were at desks. Phones were ringing at the measured pace of institutional work rather than crisis response. She felt the day settling around her. She was thinking about tomorrow, about what it would mean to go back to Harlow with an active badge and active credentials, about the patients on the ward who had been there through all of this without knowing anything except that the night shift nurse had been suspended and the hospital director had disappeared into some kind of federal situation. She was thinking about Ward 3 and the particular fluorescent quality of the light there at 2 in the morning and what it was like to check vitals for a man who was awake and watching the door. She was also thinking about the name at the bottom of Teal's expanded list, the senior DoD official whose documentation was now in federal hands, whose comfortable career-long invisibility had just ended. Caro's phone rang. She looked at the screen and her expression shifted. "I need to take this," she said, and stepped out. Sera sat with her empty cup and looked at the wall. Caro came back 3 minutes later. She closed the door behind her and stood at the end of the table rather than sitting, which was itself information. "The DoD official," she said, "the one on Teal's list. What about him?" "He went to a meeting this afternoon at a congressional office building, scheduled 2 days ago. Routine. Staff meeting for the subcommittee." Caro looked at her. There was a reporter in the hallway, Capitol Press credentials. "She's been investigating the Aldrin contract for 6 months through a different angle, public procurement records, FOI requests, the decommissioned facility in Eastern Calverton." Sera waited. "She apparently received an anonymous document package this morning," Caro said. "Someone sent her a copy of Teal's reconciliation report, the full version, the one with the expanded names list." The room went very still. Sera looked at Caro. "Fitch? That's what we think. He had the document for 18 months. He came to us this morning, but he also, apparently, made one additional distribution before he came in. He sent it to a reporter." "Yes." "This morning." "Yes." Sera put the empty cup down on the table very carefully. "So the reporter has the document." "The reporter has the document, and this afternoon she walked into a hallway at a congressional office building where the DoD official was attending a meeting, and she asked him, on the record, with a recording device, whether he could explain his presence in Teal's reconciliation report. The specific silence of a situation that has just become significantly larger than it was 10 seconds ago. "What did he say?" Sera asked. Caro looked at her steadily. "He said he'd never heard of Marcus Teal." A beat. "And then?" "And then she showed him the first page of the report," Caro said, "with his name and his signature, on an authorization document that Teal had embedded in the appendix, a document approving the contract modification that enabled the weapons reclassification protocol." Sera sat back in her chair. His own signature. On a document authorizing the mechanism through which the weapons had been reclassified for disposal, a reclassification that had made the diversion possible. A document he had apparently not known was in Teal's report. A document that Teal had included in the full version, but not the archived version, which meant that for 18 months, the man had been unaware that the specific piece of paper that connected him operationally to the scheme existed in someone else's possession. "It's going public," Sera said. "It's already public," Caro said. The story posted 11 minutes ago. The story posted at 3:47 in the afternoon, and by 4:15 it had been picked up by two national wire services. Sera watched it happen from the conference room on her phone, not the specific article, but the velocity of it, the way a piece of information moves through a networked media environment when it arrives with documentation attached. The reporter had published Thiel's reconciliation report as a primary source document alongside the story, which meant readers didn't have to take her word for anything. The signature was there. The transaction codes were there. The names were there. It was the kind of journalism that was difficult to challenge on factual grounds, because the facts were embedded in the original document, and the original document had been prepared by a Marine Corps logistics officer who had no apparent motive to fabricate it and every apparent motive to make it accurate. Kara was on the phone in the hallway for 22 minutes. When she came back, she sat down and said, "Congressional notifications are going out. The DoD official's office issued a statement 12 minutes ago calling the document unverified and the reporting irresponsible. That statement is going to have a very short shelf life given that his signature is on page 47. What happens to him now? He's been placed on administrative leave pending review. The review will take the amount of time it takes, and the outcome will depend on the weight of the evidence and the cooperation posture of everyone else in the chain." Caro paused. Ferris is already working to ensure that his cooperation documentation reaches the right desks before anyone above him can consolidate a defense. He's racing them. Everyone in this network is racing everyone else right now. That's what happens when the evidence goes public before the legal strategy is coordinated. Caro looked at her phone. Marrow, the former deputy IG, retained counsel 3 hours ago, which means his attorney knew before the story posted, which means someone in this chain has better information flow than we'd like. But not better evidence, Sera said. No, not better evidence. She put her phone down on the table. The day had the quality of something that was still moving even though the operational pressure had come off. The feeling of watching a structure continue to collapse after the initial impact has already done its work. She was tired in a way that had finally made it past the adrenaline barrier and was sitting squarely in her body, and she recognized it as the kind of tired that meant the sustained expenditure was over. She thought about the first night she had looked at Lewis Garrett's chart. The particular quality of certainty she'd had, not aggressive, not performed, just the unambiguous recognition of a wound pattern that didn't match the story attached to it. She had not known, standing at that nursing station, that the thread she was picking up ran through a military contractor and a hospital director and a corrupt detective and a weapons diversion network, and a federal official who had signed his name to the mechanism that made all of it possible. She had just known the chart was wrong. That was the whole thing, really. The chart was wrong, and she wasn't willing to pretend it wasn't. She left the field office at 6 and drove to the private clinic in the Western District where Marcus Thiel had been transferred. She had not told Caro she was going, she would tell her afterward. But this wasn't federal business. It was something else, something that didn't have a category in the case file. And she'd learned long ago that the things without categories were sometimes the most important ones to attend to. Thiel was awake. Properly awake. Not the semi-conscious grip on her wrist from his first night at Harlow. Not the careful, contained speech of a man managing how much he revealed. He was sitting up in the clinic bed with an IV still in his left arm and a hospital-issue blanket pulled to his waist, and he looked older than 38 in the specific way that people who have been carrying something unmanageable look older than their age when the carrying finally stops. He watched her come in and didn't say anything for a moment. She sat in the chair beside the bed. Outside the clinic window, the Western District was getting dark, and the streetlights had come on one by one while she was driving here, and the room had the quiet of a place that was only temporarily separate from the world outside. "The story's out," she said. "I saw it." His voice was still rough. "Someone gave it to a reporter." "Yes." "Was that you?" "No, it was the man who held your report for 18 months. Thiel looked at the ceiling. "Fitch. You knew him." "I knew he received the report. I didn't know what he'd done with it." A pause. "Or what he'd been waiting for." "He was waiting for corroboration," she said. "He had your document, but he didn't have an independent thread. When Molt was arrested, he had it." Thiel nodded slowly. "I was working through something." She could see it in the way his expression moved, not dramatically, but in the small adjustments of a person reprocessing a long sequence of events in light of new information. 18 months, he said. You held it for 18 months. I held a copy in a server archive that I wasn't sure anyone would ever find. He looked at her. I didn't have anything else. I'd already sent the formal copies and they'd gone nowhere. I'd already tried the IG process and it closed. I had one copy left and no way to use it directly without getting Ferris's network involved in my medical history. He paused. Which they were anyway. I know. The shooting on the highway wasn't random. No. They knew I'd been back in Calverton. Someone at Aldrin flagged my name when I accessed the old system to upload the archive copy. I didn't know they'd gotten that far until the shooting. He looked at his left thigh, at the bandage under the blanket. I woke up at Harlow, and I thought it was over. And then you came to check my vitals, and you were doing exactly what they didn't want you to do, reading the wound the right way. Sera didn't respond to that immediately. She was thinking about how close the entire chain had come to not connecting. If she had been a different nurse, one who revised her notes when Molt asked, one who accepted the administrative pressure when Louth applied it, one who decided that the accumulated cost of staying in place was higher than the cost of leaving, the archive copy would still be sitting in the Harlow legacy system under a ghost patient ID, and Teal would have been transferred to a private clinic and sedated and quietly disappeared from the institutional record, and Ferris would have moved his money, and the story would have ended without a story. The thread had held because she had held it. That was true. But it had also held because Teal had put it there to be found, and because Fitch had waited for the right moment, and because a reporter had been working the procurement angle for 6 months and was in the right hallway at the right time. It was not a clean, efficient system. It was a collection of individual decisions made by imperfect people in circumstances that gave them very little certainty about whether any single decision would matter. Most of those decisions hadn't felt significant when they were made. They felt significant now because of what they had accumulated into. "How are you doing?" she said. Not as a medical question. Teal considered it with the seriousness she was coming to understand was simply how he engaged with questions that deserved it. "I'm alive," he said. "That's not a nothing." "No," she agreed. "The veterans. Garrett and Pruitt and whoever else they processed through that system. Their records. Under review," she said. "The correction process is slow, but the altered records are now evidence in a federal case, which creates a different kind of leverage on the correction board than a standard review request would." "Slow," he said. The word had a weight to it. "Yes. I'm sorry." He nodded. He understood the apology was not for her failure, but for the nature of the institutions through which the remedy had to travel. The same institutions that had created the problem, now tasked with correcting it, with all the friction that implied. There was no version of this where the correction was fast enough or proportionate enough to what had been done. There was only the version where it happened versus the version where it didn't. "Tell me something," he said. "The night I grabbed your wrist, in the ward, did you already know, or were you still—" "I was still working it out," she said. "I knew the wound presentation was wrong. I knew Molt's behavior was wrong. I had a collection of documented inconsistencies and a theory about a pattern. I didn't know about Cal 7 yet. I didn't know about the routing operation." She paused. "When you said don't let them move the file, I didn't know what file. But you started looking." "I started looking." He seemed to find something in that. Not comfort exactly, but something like the confirmation of a thing he'd needed to know. That the moment of connection had been real, that his semi-conscious instruction had landed somewhere and had been taken seriously by the person who received it. "Get some sleep," she said. "The federal team will want a formal statement when you're cleared medically." "I know." He looked at his hands. "Voss." She stopped at the door. "The signature," he said. "The authorization document in the appendix. The one the reporter showed him. I put it in the full version specifically, because I knew that if the abbreviated version was ever found, the response would be to say the financial evidence was ambiguous and the transaction codes were too indirect. I needed something that couldn't be called ambiguous." He paused. "It took me 4 months to find that document in the system and confirm that his signature was on the original. I was still in the logistics chain at that point, and I had access I wasn't supposed to have for much longer. You knew it would be the one they couldn't explain away. I hoped it would be the one they couldn't explain away." A distinction he apparently felt was important. I was a logistics officer. I knew how to build a paper trail. I just had to make sure the paper trail was solid enough to survive people who were much better at destroying paper trails than I was. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "It was solid enough." She left him there in the clinic room with the IV and the dark window and the particular stillness of someone who has been running from something for a very long time and has, finally, stopped. The public collapse of the network did not happen in a single dramatic moment. It happened the way these things always happened, unevenly, over days and weeks, with some pieces moving faster than others, and some pieces moving with the bureaucratic slowness of institutions that were constitutionally resistant to moving at all. But it happened. Grayson Molt pleaded guilty to assault, witness intimidation, obstruction of justice, and civil rights violations. The attempted murder charge was reduced to aggravated assault as part of a cooperation agreement, and the cooperation was genuine. Molt, once his attorney had assessed the recording from room 412 alongside the evidence from Louth's phone and Stahl's statement, had concluded with apparent clarity that his options were limited. He was sentenced to 9 years. The judge, reading the sentencing statement, noted that the defendant had used his position of legal authority to target a medical professional performing her clinical duties in good faith, and that the sentence reflected both the conduct and the breach of institutional trust. Warren Stahl, who had turned himself in at the county sheriff's office and spent 12 hours in a negotiated cooperation session, received a sentence of 14 years on federal corruption, conspiracy, and civil rights charges. His cooperation agreement reduced the maximum exposure significantly, but left enough intact to constitute what the federal prosecutor called, at a press conference Sera did not attend, a proportionate accounting. Brennan Louth cooperated fully and early, which his attorney argued should be treated as mitigating. The judge disagreed that it was mitigating relative to the specific harm of targeting vulnerable patients in a medical setting and manipulating clinical records to cover criminal activity. He received 7 years and was permanently barred from serving in any administrative capacity in a federally funded medical facility. Garrett Solin, the deputy commander who had appeared at the press conference the morning after Molt's arrest and managed the public narrative while knowing his name was on Thiel's list, was charged separately for obstruction and conspiracy. His case moved more slowly because his attorney challenged the admissibility of certain communications, and the legal process ground forward at its own pace. The challenge was ultimately unsuccessful. Dale Merrow, the former Deputy Inspector General who had received Thiel's report and called Ferris directly, was indicted on federal corruption and obstruction charges. His early retirement package was clawed back under federal forfeiture provisions. He retained expensive counsel, and the case against him moved through the system with the particular deliberateness that cases against former federal officials tend to accumulate. Aldrin Ferris cooperated with a comprehensiveness that reflected his understanding of his position. He named names, provided documentation, corroborated financial flows, and gave statements that connected the network from his level upward with the specificity of a man who had kept meticulous records because he understood that records were insurance. His cooperation agreement reduced his exposure from what would have been a sentence measured in decades to one measured in years, 12, with eligibility for supervised release after 8. His assets were frozen and substantially forfeited. The Aldrin Supply Group was dissolved by federal order, its remaining contracts terminated and reassigned. The senior DoD official, whose signature appeared on page 47, resigned his position 4 days after the story published, before formal charges were filed, which his attorney characterized as a voluntary acceptance of responsibility. The formal charges came 3 weeks later regardless. His case, involving a career official with connections across multiple administrations, moved through a level of institutional complexity that required coordination between the DoD, the Congressional Oversight Committees, and the Department of Justice, and it moved slowly. But it moved. The veterans, Garrett, Pruitt, Thiel, and 6 others whose records had been altered through the KL7 routing operation, had their cases formally flagged by the Military Records Correction Board. The correction process was, as Sera had told Thiel, slow. It was also, she discovered through the months of following it, occasionally resistant in ways that required persistent attention. She provided that attention, not as a federal operative, but as someone who knew the specific details of each case and was willing to show up in the rooms where those details needed to be heard. The corrections were made. Not all at once, not cleanly, not without friction. but made. 3 months after Molt's arrest, Harlow Veterans Medical Center appointed an interim director while the hospital board conducted a formal search for a permanent replacement. The appointment process was more transparent than the previous one, partly because the board itself had undergone changes following the investigation's revelations about the role the hospital authority had played in Louth's recruitment. Sera returned to the hospital floor during the interim period, under the supervision of the incoming charge nurse and with the formal reinstatement of her credentials and her access. The reinstatement letter from the hospital board was 3 paragraphs and did not contain an apology, which she had not expected and was not particularly interested in receiving. The letter from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, filed separately with her personnel record, described her role in terms that were accurate and appropriately formal and would matter when the circumstances of her suspension were eventually reviewed by anyone with access to the full record. She went back to nights. Same shift, same ward, same fluorescent quality of the light at 2 in the morning. It was not the same ward, of course. The charge nurse was different. 3 of the staff nurses were new. The patients were different patients, not Garrett, not Pruitt, not Teal. New admissions, new histories, new charts that she read with the same attention she had always brought, the same willingness to notice what the paper said and compare it to what the evidence in front of her showed. She found an inconsistency in the second week. Not a criminal one, a documentation error. The kind that happened when staff were rushed and the system's autofill function made an incorrect assumption about a medication dosage. She flagged it. The resident on call corrected it. The patient received the right dose. Nothing dramatic happened. Nothing dramatic was supposed to happen. She documented it correctly and moved on. The formal recognition came in the 5th month, at a hospital board meeting that she attended because she was required to attend it, which was the only condition under which she would have gone. The board had commissioned an independent review of the events at Harlow over the prior 3 years, and the review's findings had been presented in summary at the previous meeting. This meeting was for the formal response to those findings. The board chair, a woman named Iris Pollard, who had been appointed to the position after 2 previous board members resigned under scrutiny related to their tenure during the Louth period, read sections of the summary into the record, and then looked at Sera across the conference table. The review concluded that your documentation of clinical inconsistencies was accurate, methodologically sound, and appropriate to your professional obligations, Pollard said. It further concluded that the administrative response to your documentation, specifically your suspension, was improper and constituted an institutional failure. She paused. On behalf of this board, I want to formally state that what was done to you was wrong. The suspension was an instrument of the same scheme you were attempting to expose. It should not have happened, and this board's institutional predecessors failed in their responsibility to protect a staff member performing her duties correctly. Sera sat across the table in the conference room with the afternoon light through the windows and the board members watching her and said, "Thank you." Pollard waited, as if expecting more. Sera did not provide more. The statement was complete. She did not need to perform gratitude in proportion to the time it had taken to arrive, and she did not feel particularly inclined to make the room comfortable with the simplicity of her response. The board had failed. The board had acknowledged it. Those were the facts, and the facts were sufficient. After the meeting, standing in the hallway outside the conference room, she was approached by a man she didn't recognize, mid-40s, pressed shirt, the slightly uncertain air of someone who had prepared what he was going to say and was now executing it under conditions that felt less controlled than the preparation had assumed. He introduced himself as the brother of Louis Garrett. "My brother told me about you," he said, when his record was finally corrected. "He said to find you if I could." He stopped. "He said you saw something in his chart that night and you didn't let it go, and that everything else, the whole investigation, started there." Sera looked at him. He had the same jaw as the photograph in Garrett's file. The family resemblance was clear. He was holding his hands in front of him in the posture of someone delivering something that matters and wanting to do it correctly. "Louis is doing all right," he said. "Better, now that the record is fixed. He can access his full benefits. It makes a difference. The record being right makes a difference." He paused. "He wanted me to tell you that. He's not someone who calls people, but he wanted you to know." Sera thought about Garrett's file, the original scan, the bruising distribution, the revision timestamps. The night she had looked at it and known it was wrong and had, at that moment, made a choice that was not dramatic or heroic or even consciously weighty. She had just decided that pretending not to know something was not something she was willing to do. "Tell him I'm glad," she said. It was the truest thing she could say, and she said it without dressing it up into something larger. The position was created in the 7th month. It came out of the Federal Review of Harlow's institutional structure, which had identified the absence of any dedicated patient advocacy and evidence integrity function as a contributing factor to the scheme's longevity. The recommendation was for a new role, part clinical oversight, part advocacy, part training, that would sit outside the administrative hierarchy and report directly to the board's independent review committee. The hospital board offered it to Sera. She did not accept immediately. She thought about it for 4 days, which was not indecision. She knew on the first day what she was going to do, but a considered engagement with what she was agreeing to. The role was new, which meant the constraints and the successes would both be hers to define. The role was outside the administrative hierarchy, which meant the same people who had once used that hierarchy to suspend her could not use it to manage her again. The role was connected to training, which meant she would be building something that would persist beyond her individual presence in it. She accepted on the 5th day. The work was different from night shifts, and she did not entirely stop missing night shifts. She missed the particular quality of attention that the small hours required, the way the ward was quieter and the charts demanded more from your own clinical judgment, because there was less backup, less hierarchy to defer to, more reliance on what you actually knew versus what the system told you to know. She kept one overnight rotation per week because she was not willing to give it up entirely, and because it turned out that being present on the floor in the role of someone who had been through what she had been through and had stayed anyway, communicated something to the newer staff that no training module could replicate. She built the training program over 6 months, in consultation with the Federal Review Committee and with Marcus Teal, who had recovered fully and had agreed to participate in its development as an external advisor. The program covered clinical documentation standards, patient advocacy protocols, evidence preservation under institutional pressure, and the specific mechanisms by which vulnerable patients, veterans, elderly patients, anyone in a situation of reduced institutional power, were susceptible to the kind of manipulation that had run through Harlow for 3 years. It was not a perfect program. The first iteration had gaps, and the second iteration fixed some of them and introduced new ones, and the third iteration was better than both. This was how things were built, not perfectly, but progressively, by people who were willing to identify what wasn't working and correct it without becoming defensive about the fact that it hadn't been right the first time. She was not always easy to work with. She had opinions, and she stated them, and she had a low tolerance for institutional inertia and a shorter fuse than she would have liked when documentation was sloppy or advocacy was performed rather than practiced. She knew this about herself. She worked on it with mixed results, which was also how things went. The ceremony in the 9th month was not her idea. The hospital board had decided that the formal recognition of the events at Harlow, the investigation, the verdicts, the institutional reform, warranted a public event, and the public event warranted acknowledging the specific people whose actions had made the reform possible. Sera would have preferred a different format, but she had learned that institutions needed ceremonies the way people needed sleep, not because they were inherently valuable, but because they served a function that nothing else quite replaced. And declining to participate was less useful than showing up and letting the function be served. The room held approximately 80 people: hospital staff, federal agents from the investigation, representatives from the veterans advocacy organizations that had been involved in the records correction process, several of the veterans themselves. Marcus Teal was in the 3rd row, sitting straight in a chair with his hands in his lap, watching the proceedings with the careful attention of someone who had seen too much institutional performance to mistake it for substance, but was reserving judgment on whether this particular instance had substance underneath it. Lewis Garrett was in the back row. She spotted him when she came in, and he nodded once, which was how she understood he would communicate whatever he'd come to communicate, and she nodded back. Carol was standing near the door in a dark jacket, not in an official capacity. She had come on her own time, which Sera had not expected and found she was more grateful for than she'd anticipated. Iris Pollard spoke first, covering the institutional history of the reform and the board's commitments going forward. Then a representative from the federal prosecutor's office spoke briefly about the case outcomes. Then one of the veterans' advocates spoke about the records correction process and what it had meant for the individuals affected. Then Pollard turned to Sera. Sera stood and walked to the front of the room and looked at the 80 people in it, at Teal and Caro and Garrett and the staff nurses and the federal agents and the veterans and the families who had come because someone they cared about had been inside the machine that had been running through this building. She had prepared something to say. She had written it out and then crossed most of it out, which was usually how her best thinking worked. The first draft was what she expected to feel, and the revision was closer to what was actually true. "I've been asked to speak about what happened here," she said. "I'm not going to talk about the investigation. The record is complete on that. What I want to say is something smaller." She looked at the room. "I looked at a chart. I noticed that what the chart said and what the evidence showed didn't match. And I made a decision that a lot of people in my position would not have made. And I understand why they wouldn't have. The cost of noticing things that institutions want unnoticed is real. It is not abstract. It comes for your job and your reputation, and sometimes your safety. And it comes quickly and with the full weight of whoever has decided that your noticing is the problem." She paused. "I'm not standing here to tell you that I wasn't afraid or that it was easy or that I always knew it was going to work out. None of that is true. I made decisions that I wasn't certain about. I stayed in situations where I wasn't certain I was reading them correctly. I documented things whose significance I didn't fully understand at the time. And I sent an email from my car in a parking structure to a contact I hadn't spoken to in 2 years, not knowing whether it would go anywhere." She looked at Teal. "The reason this worked is not because I am exceptional. The reason this worked is that Marcus Teal built an evidence trail 18 months before I found it, knowing there was no guarantee that anyone would ever look. The reason this worked is that Roland Fitch held a document for 18 months under circumstances that gave him every institutional incentive to destroy it. The reason this worked is that a reporter spent 6 months on public procurement records that most people would have found impenetrable, and she was in a hallway at the right moment because she had done the unglamorous work that made her presence in that hallway possible." She looked back at the room. "What I want to say, the thing I keep coming back to, is that the most important decisions in this entire sequence were made by people who had no certainty. They were doing anything except the right thing in the moment they were in. There was no guarantee. There was no map. There was just a set of individual people who each decided separately that they were not willing to let what they knew disappear." She stood in the room with the afternoon light and the 80 people and said, "The people who ran this scheme spent years betting that everyone they were up against would eventually decide the personal cost was too high. They were right about most people. They were wrong about enough of us." She stepped back. The applause was not the thing that mattered, and she didn't let it land as the thing that mattered. What mattered was Teal in the third row, who had straightened slightly and whose expression had moved in a way that was barely perceptible, and probably only visible to someone who had learned to read the small movements of people who kept most of what they felt off their faces. What mattered was Garrett in the back row, who was clapping with the self-contained energy of a man who had come a long distance to do this specific thing and was going to do it fully. What mattered was Caro by the door, who was not clapping. She was just watching, with the look she had when something had gone the way it was supposed to go, and she was letting herself acknowledge it for exactly as long as the moment required. After the ceremony, when most of the room had moved to the hallway for the reception, Sera stood at the window on the far side of the conference room and looked out at Calverton, the industrial cranes, the water tower, the edge of the parking structure where she had once sat in her car, and composed an email that she wasn't sure would go anywhere. The city looked the way it always looked. It did not look different because significant things had happened inside it. Cities rarely did. They went on with their particular, indifferent momentum, and the events that felt enormous from the inside registered as barely perceptible from the outside, and most of what mattered happened in rooms and corridors and parking structures and server rooms that the city as a whole would never know existed. She was all right with that. She had not done any of this to change what the city looked like from a window. Teal came to stand beside her. He did not say anything immediately, which she had come to understand was his default. He let silence do the work that other people rushed to fill with words. After a moment he said, "The program. The training." "Yes." "You're going to keep running it?" "Yes." He looked out the window. "Good. He paused. The part you said about no guarantee, about just doing the right thing in the moment you're in. Yes, that's accurate. He said it with the authority of someone who has tested the proposition thoroughly. I want you to know that it's accurate even when the moment you're in is a hospital bed, 18 months after you built the evidence and you still don't know if it went anywhere. She looked at him. Was that the hardest part? He considered it. Not knowing, he said. Not knowing if it mattered. Not knowing if anyone found it. Not knowing if the person I handed it to in the dark actually... He stopped. Yes, that was the hardest part. She understood. She had had the benefit of being inside the action, of watching the threads connect, of being present for the moments when the pattern became visible. Teal had built the foundation and then been removed from the building before the structure went up. He had been left with the not knowing, which was a specific and difficult thing to carry. It mattered, she said. I know that now. It mattered from the beginning, she said. You just couldn't see it yet. He turned from the window. He was going to say something, and then he didn't, because what she had said was sufficient, and he was a man who recognized sufficiency. He left the room, and she stayed at the window a little longer. She thought about the nurse she had been when she started at Harlow, the one who kept her head down, finished her documentation, didn't make enemies, didn't make friends. The discipline she had borrowed from an older life. The practiced invisibility of someone who had decided the cost of being seen was higher than the cost of being overlooked. She had been wrong about that. Not wrong that the cost was real. The cost had been exactly as real as she'd feared. She had been wrong that paying it was avoidable. The cost of staying invisible had turned out to be 3 veterans with altered records and a weapons diversion network that ran for 3 years, and a detective who entered a room at night with a gloved hand and the assumption that the woman he was silencing had no one behind her. She had not been invisible. She had been underestimated. And the difference between those two things had turned out to be the thing that mattered most. She pressed one hand flat against the window glass, the same precision with which she had once pressed her hand against a wrist in the dark, and looked out at the city doing its ordinary, indifferent thing, and she understood that she was going back to work tomorrow, not with a chest full of clarity and resolve, with a clipboard and a training agenda, and the knowledge that 3 of the nurses starting this week had never been properly taught how to document a wound trajectory, and that was the work that was in front of her, and it was enough. The woman who had walked out of Harlow with her badge on the counter and Molt watching from the end of the corridor walked back to the room where 80 people were eating and talking and did not walk in as a hero. She walked in as the person who was going to be here tomorrow, doing the work, with the understanding that the work was the thing. Not the ceremony, not the recognition, not the verdict that had finally come down on the right side. The work, and the refusal to let what she knew disappear. That was the whole of it. That had always been the whole of it.